The house at 30 East Drive, located in the peaceful market town of Pontefract, appeared to be the ideal home for the Pritchard family. It was an unassuming, brick-built council house on the edge of Chesterfield Estate, with nothing to suggest that it would soon become the center of one of the most disturbing supernatural stories in Britain's history. Joe and Zhang Pritchard, along with their two children, Philip and Diane, moved into the house in the summer of 1966, hopeful and excited for their new life. Joe was a hard-working man, and Zhang was a devoted mother. Their son, Philip, was 15, a quiet and respectful boy, while their daughter, Diane, was 12, full of energy and spirit. They were an average family, hoping for a quiet and comfortable life in their new home. For a few days, everything was as normal as anyone could expect. The family went about their daily routines, settling into the neighborhood and decorating the house. The neighborhood was quiet, with friendly neighbors and a welcoming atmosphere. It seemed like the perfect place to build new memories. But it wasn't long before small, strange occurrences began to unsettle the family. Initially, these events were minor, barely noticeable in the hustle and bustle of daily life. It started with an odd feeling in certain rooms, a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air, or the sense of being watched, although no one was there. The family shrugged it off, thinking it was just their imaginations or the usual sounds of a settling house. Things soon escalated. One day, as Zhang was preparing lunch in the kitchen, she noticed a sudden gust of wind that seemed to blow through the room, despite the windows being closed. A light mist formed, and the temperature dropped noticeably. She shook it off, convinced it was some odd draft from the old windows, but the strange atmosphere lingered in her mind. Then came the small but disturbing incidents. Furniture would move ever so slightly when no one was in the room. Items would disappear and reappear in odd places, and lights would flicker as if there were electrical issues. Joe tried to rationalize these events, insisting it must be faulty wiring or simple household accidents. But Jan, always more sensitive to these things, began to feel uneasy. She had the growing suspicion that something was off, though she wasn't ready to voice it just yet. The turning point came during a family gathering. Joe's sister, Auntie Maud, was visiting. They were all sitting in the living room, enjoying tea, when suddenly a fine powder fell from above, like chalk dust. The strange part? There was no source for the powder. The ceiling and walls were intact, and there was no sign of damage. As the powder gently floated down, covering the furniture and settling into the fabric of their clothing, they all sat in stunned silence. Auntie Maud was the first to speak, breaking the uncomfortable quiet. "It's not natural," she said in a low voice, her face pale. "There's something in this house." Joe, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as debris from the roof. But deep down, he too began to feel a creeping unease. His rational explanations no longer seemed adequate, but he wasn't ready to admit that something inexplicable might be happening in his home. That night, things took a darker turn. As the family prepared for bed, Diane, their young daughter, let out a terrified scream from her room. The family rushed upstairs to find her sobbing, pointing to the corner of the room. She claimed she had seen a dark, shadowy figure standing there, watching her. Joe checked every corner, under the bed, and in the closet, but found nothing. Diane's terror seemed real, though, and Zhang couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was sharing their space. The disturbances continued, growing stronger and more frequent. The most unnerving events seemed to focus on Diane, as if something in the house had taken a particular interest in her. The family tried to carry on with life as usual, but it was becoming harder to ignore the mounting evidence that something was very wrong. Objects began to move more violently. Chairs would topple over. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed through empty rooms. One afternoon, when Philip was home alone, he experienced something he would never forget. As he sat in the living room reading, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped, and he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, only to see nothing. Then, without warning, the curtains by the window started to sway, as if caught by a breeze. Only the windows were closed. Philip froze, staring at the moving fabric, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of heavy, dragging footsteps filled the room, though no one was there. Terrified, he ran out of the house and didn't return until the rest of the family came home. It was becoming clear to everyone that the disturbances were not just random events or tricks of the mind. There was something else at work in 30 East Drive, something dark and malevolent. As days turned into weeks, the family could no longer deny the presence that haunted their home. Even the neighbors began to notice strange things, and word spread quickly through the small town of Pontefract. Though they tried to keep up appearances and carry on with their lives, the Pritchards were living in fear. They no longer felt safe in their own home, and as the activity escalated, they realized that the forces they were dealing with were far beyond anything they could understand or control. The Pritchards soon found themselves caught in a nightmare that would grow more terrifying with each passing day. Little did they know, their troubles had only just begun, and the figure that had first appeared in the corner of Diane's room would soon make its presence known in far more sinister ways. As the Pritchard family struggled to make sense of the eerie occurrences in their home, the atmosphere in 30 East Drive grew increasingly oppressive. It was no longer a question of random events. They were living alongside something unseen, something with an apparent will of its own. And, as many believed, the disturbances were tied to a sinister figure from Pontefract's past. The town's history held a dark secret that locals whispered about, especially those who lived near the area. According to legend, during the 16th century, a monk was executed for committing heinous acts. His death took place near what would later become Chequerfield Estate, where 30 East Drive now stood. Some believed that this monk's restless spirit had never left the land. They said he was filled with anger, and his presence was being felt again, this time by the Pritchards. The family, previously unaware of this history, began to wonder if the strange activity in their home could be connected to this dark past. Things took a dramatic turn when physical manifestations of the haunting began. No longer were these just odd sensations, noises, or moving objects. The spirit or whatever force haunted the house became much more direct in its approach. It started with Philip, the older child. One night, while he was in his bedroom, he felt an icy grip on his wrist, as though someone or something invisible had grabbed him. His arm was yanked so hard that he tumbled from his bed. Shaken, Philip scrambled to his feet, but when he looked around, there was no one there. His heart raced, and he ran to his parents, struggling to explain what had happened. Although Joe and Zhang tried to calm him down, they couldn't deny the growing sense of dread. Whatever was in their house had become more aggressive, and the family feared for their safety. Diane, however, seemed to be the primary target. The young girl began experiencing the most frightening events. One evening, as she was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she suddenly felt her hair being pulled sharply backward, as if someone had yanked it. Diane spun around, expecting to see Philip playing a prank, but no one was there. Before she could scream, she was pushed by an unseen force, causing her to stumble to the floor. She was unharmed, but the shock and terror left her frozen in place, unable to speak. The Pritchards could no longer pretend that these incidents were mere coincidences. The physical attacks on Diane, in particular, were impossible to ignore. They reached out for help, but finding answers was no easy task. Joe, still a skeptic at heart, called in an electrician to check the wiring, thinking that faulty electricity might explain the flickering lights and odd noises. However, the electrician found no issues with the wiring, and the disturbances continued unabated. In desperation, Zhang turned to the local church. She invited a priest to bless the house, hoping that this would finally rid their home of the dark presence. The priest performed a blessing, walking from room to room, sprinkling holy water and offering prayers. But far from calming the situation, the activity only grew more intense after the priest's visit. Objects began flying across the room with violent force plates, books, even heavy furniture would move as if thrown by invisible hands. Doors would slam shut with such power that the entire house seemed to shake. The spirit appeared to be mocking their attempts to cleanse the house, growing bolder and more aggressive with each passing day. At this point, it was no longer just the Pritchards who were witnessing the strange events. Friends, relatives, and neighbors who visited the house reported seeing objects move on their own or hearing strange noises. One neighbor, who had always been a staunch skeptic of the supernatural, left the house in a panic after witnessing a chair slide across the room without anyone touching it. The haunting was becoming impossible to deny. It was during this time that the Pritchards learned about the infamous legend of the Black Monk. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the dark figure believed to haunt the land. The monk, they said, had been executed for crimes so terrible that his spirit was doomed to walk the earth, full of anger and vengeance. The family began to wonder if this malevolent presence could be the source of their suffering. The poltergeist activity seemed focused not only on Diane but also on a particular area of the house, the staircase. Diane frequently felt the icy grip of an invisible hand on the back of her neck as she climbed the stairs, as though she was being watched or worse, followed. On several occasions, she was pushed or pulled as she ascended the steps, causing her to fall and bruise herself. These assaults left the young girl terrified to be alone in the house, and her previously bright and energetic demeanor began to fade. The disturbances escalated to the point that the family could no longer sleep peacefully. Loud bangs echoed through the house at all hours of the night, sometimes shaking the walls. Phantom footsteps could be heard pacing up and down the hallway. The family was trapped in a state of constant fear, unsure when or where the next attack would come. With no other options, the Pritchards contacted a team of paranormal investigators. The investigators, intrigued by the reports of such intense activity, arrived at 30 East Drive armed with cameras, recording equipment, and other tools designed to detect the presence of spirits. The investigators soon realized that they were dealing with a particularly strong entity. During their visit, they witnessed chairs being thrown across the room, doors slamming shut on their own, and eerie voices whispering in the air, though no one was speaking. One of the investigators reported seeing the dark outline of a figure at the top of the staircase, a tall hooded shape that seemed to watch them before disappearing into thin air. It was the first time the figure of the Black Monk had been seen in the house by an outsider, further fueling the belief that this malevolent force was behind the haunting. As the investigators left, they could offer no solutions, only confirmation that the Pritchards were not imagining the horrors they were experiencing. The spirit in their home was real, and it wasn't going anywhere. Despite all their efforts, the family remained at the mercy of the poltergeist. Every attempt to rid the house of the dark presence seemed to provoke it further. The Pritchards' lives were now dominated by fear, and the sense of normalcy they once enjoyed had been completely shattered. The legend of the Black Monk had become their reality, and they were powerless to escape its grasp. As the weeks passed, the disturbances in 30 East Drive reached an all-time high. What had once been small, unsettling incidents had now become violent and unpredictable. The Pritchard family lived in a constant state of anxiety, unsure of when the next outburst would occur or how severe it might be. It was during this time that the terrifying figure of the Black Monk became fully visible, and his presence would forever change the lives of those in the house. It began with a shadow. One evening, Zhang was cleaning the kitchen when she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A dark shape moved quickly past the doorway. At first, she assumed it was Philip or Joe, but when she called out to them, there was no answer. She checked the living room and the hallway, but no one was there. The rest of the family was upstairs, and they hadn't come downstairs at all. Shaken, Zhang tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light or her imagination. But that night, the same shadow appeared again this time. It was seen by both Philip and Diane. It wasn't long before all the members of the Pritchard family had witnessed the dark figure moving silently through the house. The figure was always fleeting, disappearing just as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to fill the family with dread. Then, the black monk fully revealed himself. One night, as Diane was preparing for bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air in her room became stifling, and the familiar cold chill set in. She turned to leave the room, but before she could reach the door, she froze in terror. Standing in the corner, partially obscured by the shadows, was a tall hooded figure dressed in black robes. His face was hidden, but Diane could feel his gaze fixed on her. She stood frozen, unable to move or cry out. After what felt like an eternity, the figure vanished, leaving Diane trembling and gasping for breath. When she finally managed to scream, her parents rushed into the room. Diane sobbed as she explained what she had seen, and the fear in her eyes left no doubt in their minds that she had truly encountered something terrifying. From that point on, the black monk became a regular presence in the house. The family often saw him lurking in the hallway, at the top of the stairs, or standing in the shadows of a room. He never spoke, but his appearance always preceded the most violent outbursts of poltergeist activity. The family soon realized that whenever they saw the monk, something terrible was about to happen. One of the most terrifying events occurred one evening while the family was gathered in the living room. Suddenly, without warning, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. As Joe fumbled to find a flashlight, they all heard a loud, menacing thump coming from the hallway. The noise grew louder and closer, like heavy footsteps stomping toward the room. The family huddled together in fear, listening to the footsteps as they stopped just outside the door. And then, with a violent crash, the door to the living room flew open. The shadowy figure of the black monk stood in the doorway, looming over them. Objects around the room began to rattle and shake, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The family sat frozen in place, watching in horror as the monk slowly disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving the house in complete silence. Despite the terror, the family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Joe still went to work, Zhang still cared for the home, and Philip and Diane attended school. But the strain of living in a haunted house was taking its toll. Diane, in particular, became withdrawn and anxious. The attacks on her became more frequent and more violent. On several occasions, she was physically pushed or pulled by an unseen force, leaving bruises and scratches on her arms and legs. One of the most shocking events occurred when Diane was walking up the staircase. Suddenly, an invisible force grabbed her by the throat and lifted her several feet off the ground. Gasping for air, she struggled to free herself, but the grip only tightened. Her family, hearing her desperate cries, rushed to the staircase and watched in horror as Diane was suspended in midair, her legs kicking frantically. Joe grabbed her, and as soon as he made contact, she dropped to the floor, gasping and sobbing. It was clear that the poltergeist had a particular fixation on Diane, and the family feared for her safety. They tried everything they could think of to protect her. Zhang sprinkled holy water around the house, and they even brought in a medium who claimed to have experience dealing with violent spirits, but nothing seemed to work. The black monk's presence only grew stronger, and the attacks on Diane became more brutal. As word of the haunting spread, it attracted the attention of the media and paranormal investigators. Journalists flocked to Pontefract to cover the story, and their reports brought a mixture of skepticism and fascination from the public. Some dismissed the haunting as a hoax, believing that the family was seeking attention or playing pranks. Others, however, were convinced that the Pritchards were dealing with something very real and very dangerous. The investigators who visited the house came with various tools, cameras, recording devices, and electromagnetic field detectors. Many hoped to capture evidence of the supernatural forces at play. While not all were successful, some investigators left the house convinced that something otherworldly was occurring. Several reported witnessing objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut without cause, and cold spots that could not be explained by drafts or faulty heating systems. One investigator, while setting up a camera on the staircase, claimed to have seen the figure of the black monk at the top of the stairs. He described the monk as a tall, dark figure wearing long robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. The investigator said that as soon as the figure appeared, the room grew deathly cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The monk vanished just as quickly as he had appeared, leaving the investigator shaken and convinced that the Pritchards were telling the truth. Despite the growing attention, the haunting showed no signs of stopping. The black monk continued to terrorize the family, particularly Diane. By now, the once happy home had become a place of fear and despair. The Pritchards felt trapped, unable to escape the malevolent force that had taken over their lives. The haunting had reached its peak, and the Pritchard family was left to wonder how much more they could endure. The Black Monk of Pontefract had made his presence known in the most terrifying way, and the family's nightmare seemed far from over. After months of living under constant attack, the Pritchard family began to lose hope that they would ever be free from the torment of the Black Monk. Each day brought new horrors, and the relentless nature of the poltergeist's activities was wearing them down physically, emotionally, and mentally. The once vibrant and lively home had become a place of deep fear and anxiety, a house where every corner held the possibility of danger. The family's well-being was unraveling as the haunting entered a terrifying new phase. Zhang, who had always been the pillar of strength for the family, was now struggling to keep herself together. The stress of living with the constant supernatural activity was taking its toll on her health. She began losing sleep, staying awake through the night, listening for the familiar sounds of footsteps or watching for the sudden movement of furniture. Her face grew pale, her eyes dark with exhaustion. Even in the daylight, Zhang felt no relief. She became haunted by the feeling that she was always being watched, as if the Black Monk's presence followed her no matter where she went. Zhou, too, was suffering. While he had initially dismissed the haunting as nothing more than superstition, the events he had witnessed over the past months had shaken his resolve. As the head of the family, he felt responsible for protecting his wife and children, but the unseen entity terrorizing their home was beyond his control. No amount of logic or rational thought could explain what was happening in their house, and Zhou, a man of practical solutions, found himself helpless. His frustration grew as each attempt to rid the house of the Black Monk only seemed to make things worse. He began avoiding home as much as possible, staying late at work or finding reasons to run errands to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The children, Philip and Diane, were perhaps the most deeply affected by the haunting. Philip, once a quiet and studious boy, had become distant and withdrawn. The events at 30 East Drive had stolen the innocence of his youth, replacing it with fear and anxiety. He no longer felt safe in his own home, and the constant activity had left him on edge. He tried to focus on schoolwork and friends, but the shadow of the Black Monk loomed over every aspect of his life. Philip no longer invited friends over, afraid of what they might witness, and he often stayed away from home, just as his father did. Diane, however, remained the primary focus of the Black Monk's attacks. The entity seemed to take a particular interest in her, and the intensity of the haunting grew even more terrifying when she was present. At night, Diane's bed would shake violently, waking her in the early hours of the morning. She would often wake up to find her blankets ripped away or the furniture in her room moved to impossible angles. On one occasion, Diane awoke to find herself being dragged out of bed by an invisible force, her screams echoing through the house as her parents rushed to her side. The bruises and scratches on her body were constant reminders of the malevolent force that tormented her. Diane had once been a spirited and outgoing girl, but the months of terror had broken her. She became increasingly isolated, fearful of going to sleep and afraid to be alone in any room of the house. Her friends, noticing the changes in her demeanor, slowly drifted away, unsure of how to help her and wary of the rumors about her haunted home. Diane was left feeling trapped and alone, unable to escape the darkness that seemed to cling to her every moment. By now, the house had become a living nightmare. The Black Monk's appearances were frequent and aggressive, no longer confined to fleeting glimpses in darkened rooms. The figure would manifest fully in front of the family, standing motionless at the top of the stairs or in the corners of rooms, watching them with unseen eyes. His presence always carried with it a deep, unnatural cold that chilled the air and filled the family with dread. The Pritchards began to avoid certain parts of the house altogether, particularly the staircase where the Black Monk's activity was strongest. The once comforting routine of family life had completely unraveled. Meals were eaten in tense silence, and conversations were short, focused only on the necessary. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, the sense of dread and fear growing stronger with each passing day. Even the small relief the family had once found in daylight had faded. The Black Monk's presence was no longer confined to the night. It now manifested at any hour. Zhang would often hear footsteps in the hallway during the day or find objects mysteriously moved even when she was home alone. As the haunting intensified, Zhang sought help once more. She reached out to more paranormal investigators, hoping that anyone, could provide answers or a solution. One investigator, known for his experience in dealing with violent hauntings, arrived at 30 East Drive with a team of assistants and a collection of advanced equipment. They set up cameras throughout the house, aiming to capture proof of the Black Monk's presence. Microphones were placed in every room, designed to pick up the slightest sound of ghostly activity. For the first few hours, the house was eerily quiet. The investigators recorded little more than the normal creaks and groans of an old home. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. Cold spots began to form in the rooms, moving from one location to another, impossible to explain. The cameras captured strange, unexplained shadows moving across the walls, and the microphones picked up faint, disembodied voices. But the most disturbing event occurred when one of the investigators was alone in Diane's room, setting up additional equipment. As he stood by the window, checking the camera's angle, he felt a sudden, powerful push from behind. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself before crashing into the dresser. He turned quickly, expecting to see one of his colleagues playing a prank, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The investigator, pale and shaken, left the room immediately, convinced that whatever haunted the house was not something to be trifled with. Despite the physical evidence they gathered, the investigators, like so many before them, could offer no real solution to the Pritchards. The Black Monk remained as strong as ever, seemingly immune to any attempts to remove him from the house. The team left with their findings, but the family was once again left to face the haunting alone. As the haunting reached its darkest point, the family's resilience was pushed to the breaking point. Zhang, once the backbone of the household, now openly considered leaving the house for good. But moving wasn't an easy option. Financially, the family was tied to the house, and they feared that the Black Monk might follow them wherever they went. Joe, too, considered leaving, but the practicalities of such a move weighed heavily on him. Despite the horrors they had endured, the family was trapped in 30 East Drive, held hostage by forces they could not understand or control. The darkness in the house was palpable, and the once happy family was crumbling under the weight of the Black Monk's presence. With nowhere else to turn and no end in sight, the Pritchards were left to face the terrifying reality that their home was no longer their own. The malevolent spirit of the Black Monk had claimed it, and they were living at the mercy of his relentless and cruel attacks. As the Pritchard family entered the final months of their ordeal, it seemed that the Black Monk's grip on their home had reached a terrifying climax. Every day brought new attacks, and the once hopeful efforts to rid the house of the malevolent spirit had all but ceased. The family was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and mentally. Though they had considered leaving, fear of the unknown and financial constraints kept them locked within the haunted walls of 30 East Drive. But now, the haunting would take an even more sinister turn, leading to an event that would mark the darkest point in their battle against the entity. One late autumn evening, the air in the house felt particularly heavy, as if something monumental was about to happen. Zhang noticed it first, a silence that was far too eerie, as if the house itself was holding its breath. There were no familiar creaks or footsteps, no cold spots or rattling objects. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like the Black Monk had gone, but the family had lived through too many horrors to believe that so easily. Something was coming. Diane, who had been the primary target of the attacks, was upstairs in her bedroom when she heard a faint rhythmic tapping. At first, she tried to ignore it, knowing that responding to any odd sound could make things worse. But as the tapping grew louder, it became impossible to dismiss. She sat up in bed, staring at the far wall where the noise seemed to be originating. Then, without warning, the bed began to shake violently. This was something she had experienced before, but the force was far stronger now. Her heart raced as the bed lifted slightly off the floor, and Diane screamed for her parents. Zhang and Joe rushed up the stairs, finding Diane huddled in the corner of her room, trembling and pale. The bed had been overturned, and the furniture in the room was scattered haphazardly. Before they could comfort her, the temperature in the room dropped rapidly. They all felt it, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to freeze them in place. And then, out of the shadows, he appeared. The Black Monk stood at the foot of the overturned bed, his dark hooded figure looming over the room. This was no fleeting glimpse. His presence was more solid, more real than ever before. Zhang gasped, clutching Joe's arm, her fear overwhelming her. The figure moved slowly, silently, as if gliding across the floor. Diane could feel his gaze, though his face remained obscured beneath the hood. Her body tensed, every instinct telling her to run, but she couldn't move. Then, with a sudden and terrifying speed, the entity lunged toward Diane. She felt an invisible force grip her throat, and before anyone could react, she was lifted into the air. Zhang screamed as Diane's body was pinned against the wall, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. Joe, panicked, ran toward her, but as soon as he got close, the air around Diane seemed to ripple with a dark energy, and he was thrown back across the room. Zhang desperately tried to reach Diane, but her own body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if something was holding her back. Diane's eyes were wide with terror as she struggled to breathe, clawing at her neck as though trying to pry off invisible hands. The Black Monk watched from the shadows, his presence thick in the air, exuding a sense of cruel satisfaction. It was at that moment that something shifted. Diane's body dropped to the floor, gasping for air as the grip on her throat released. The Black Monk remained in the room, his figure still as stone, but the oppressive force had lifted just enough for the family to regain some control. Zhang and Joe rushed to Diane's side, pulling her away from the wall. Though terrified, they knew they had to act fast. This could no longer be ignored. They needed help, and they needed it immediately. Desperate, Joe called a local priest, hoping for some form of divine intervention. The priest, Father Lyons, had heard of the hauntings at 30 East Drive, though he had been hesitant to get involved. But hearing the panic in Joe's voice, he agreed to come at once. By the time he arrived, the house felt like a powder keg ready to explode. The atmosphere was charged with a malevolent energy that even Father Lyons could sense the moment he crossed the threshold. Father Lyons came prepared with holy water, a Bible, and a deep sense of faith. As he entered the house, he immediately felt the presence of something dark and unholy. The temperature dropped around him, and the familiar tapping sound began once more, growing louder as he moved through the house. He went directly to Diane's room, where the most violent activity had occurred. The family gathered behind him, watching nervously as Father Lyons stood in the center of the room. He began to pray, sprinkling holy water along the walls and over the bed, asking for protection and deliverance from the evil that plagued the home. As his voice rose in strength, the room seemed to react violently. Objects flew off shelves, smashing against the walls. The bed frame rattled and creaked, as if something was trying to break it apart. But Father Lyons stood firm, his prayers unwavering. Suddenly, the figure of the black monk materialized in the corner of the room. His presence was undeniable, a shadow that moved with a purpose. He seemed agitated, angry at the intrusion. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights flickered wildly. Father Lyons continued his prayer, louder now, his words commanding the spirit to leave the house and never return. The black monk moved forward, his dark form towering over Father Lyons, as if challenging him. For a moment, the air in the room became thick and oppressive, the tension unbearable. But Father Lyons did not falter. He threw holy water in the direction of the black monk, his voice ringing out with authority. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if caught between two worlds. The energy in the room reached a fever pitch, with objects crashing around them, the walls shaking as if the house itself was being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The black monk vanished, his shadowy figure dissolving into nothingness. The temperature began to rise, and the room fell silent. The house, for the first time in months, felt still. The Pritchard family stood in stunned silence, barely able to believe that it was over. Father Lyons lowered his Bible, his face pale but calm. He assured them that the entity had been driven out, but he warned them that such evil forces never fully disappear. Vigilance, he said, was key. In the days that followed, the house remained quiet. The Pritchards, though still wary, began to reclaim their lives. Diane slowly recovered from the trauma of her ordeal, and Zhang found herself able to sleep through the night once more. Joe, ever the skeptic, cautiously allowed himself to believe that the worst was behind them. Though the family would never forget the terror they had endured, they were grateful for the peace that had finally come to their home. The Black Monk of Pontefract had retreated into the shadows, his presence lingering in the history of 30 East Drive, but no longer controlling the lives of the Pritchards. Whether he was truly gone or simply waiting, no one could say for certain. But for now, the family could breathe again, thankful to have survived the darkest chapter of their lives. The story of the Stanley Hotel begins long before the first whispers of ghosts or strange occurrences were ever uttered. It starts with a man Freeland Oscar Stanley, whose vision of luxury and elegance would bring to life one of the most iconic hotels in the world, nestled in the rugged wilderness of Estes Park, Colorado. Freeland Oscar Stanley, born in 1849, was no ordinary businessman. Alongside his twin brother, Francis Edgar Stanley, he had already built a legacy, having invented the Stanley Steamer, a steam-powered automobile that brought them both wealth and fame. But by the early 1900s, Freeland's health began to deteriorate. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a common and often fatal illness at the time. Doctors advised him to seek out the fresh, clean air of the mountains to help improve his condition. Like many others in his situation, Stanley journeyed west in search of a cure. In 1903, Stanley and his wife, Flora, arrived in Estes Park, Colorado, and something about the place captivated him. The crisp mountain air and stunning views seemed to breathe new life into his weakened lungs. To his surprise and delight, his health improved drastically. Grateful for this transformation, Stanley envisioned turning Estes Park into a world-class tourist destination, one that would attract the wealthy and elite from across the country. But if he was going to bring the high society of America to the Rocky Mountains, they would need accommodations befitting their status. With that thought in mind, Stanley set to work building his dream, the Stanley Hotel. Construction on the Stanley Hotel began in 1907. Stanley spared no expense, importing materials from the East Coast and bringing in skilled craftsmen to build a structure that was as opulent as anything one might find in New York or Boston. This grand estate, perched at the foot of the mountains, would be a symbol of elegance in the heart of the untamed wilderness. The design of the hotel was influenced by colonial revival architecture, with a sweeping veranda that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. Inside, it boasted modern amenities that were rare in this part of the country at the time, including electricity, telephones in every room, and bathrooms with running water. The hotel was a marvel of luxury, and when it opened its doors in 1909, it quickly became a hotspot for the rich and famous. Stanley and his wife were more than just the owners. They were hosts. Flora, a talented pianist, often played concerts in the grand music room, while Stanley personally welcomed guests and regaled them with stories. It was a place of joy, celebration, and escape, a retreat from the troubles of the world. But while the hotel thrived, there were already whispers that something wasn't quite right. Even in its earliest days, the Stanley Hotel was a place of contrasts, luxury surrounded by the raw beauty of nature, life thriving in the shadow of the mountains, and, as some would soon believe, the living sharing space was something else. The first reports of strange occurrences were subtle, easily dismissed by most. Guests would mention feeling uneasy in certain areas of the hotel, a chill in the air despite the warmth of the fireplaces, or the sensation of being watched when no one was there. These early stories were easy to brush aside. Old buildings creak, the wind whistles through the mountains, and people's imaginations run wild in unfamiliar places. At first, these small, unsettling moments were nothing more than the occasional whisper among guests and staff. But as the years passed, these stories grew in number and strangeness. One of the most famous events in the early history of the Stanley Hotel occurred in 1911. During a violent thunderstorm, the power went out, and the hotel staff scrambled to light lanterns to ensure the guests remained comfortable. Elizabeth Wilson, the hotel's head chambermaid, was tasked with lighting the gas lamps in room 217, one of the hotel's most luxurious suites. As Wilson entered the room, unaware that there was a gas leak, she struck a match, igniting a massive explosion that destroyed part of the second floor. Miraculously, Wilson survived the blast but was severely injured. After a long recovery, she returned to work at the hotel, continuing her duties until her eventual passing years later. Yet, it seems that Wilson's connection to the Stanley Hotel didn't end with her life. Soon after her death, guests began reporting strange occurrences in room 217. The bed covers would be neatly tucked when no one had entered the room. Luggage would be unpacked, and the lights would turn on and off on their own. Some guests even reported feeling a cool presence in the room, as if someone were standing beside them, watching over them. These events marked the beginning of what would become one of the most famous hauntings at the Stanley Hotel, and room 217 would go on to become a focal point of the hotel's eerie reputation. As the years went on, Stanley continued to pour his heart and soul into the hotel, and he remained closely tied to it until his death in 1940. But even death it seems, couldn't keep him away. Guests and staff alike have reported seeing an elderly man resembling F.O. Stanley wandering the halls of the hotel, his figure often spotted in the lobby or near the hotel's bar. It's said that he still checks in on the place, ensuring that it runs smoothly as it did in life. Whether these sightings are the result of active imaginations or something more, the stories have persisted for decades. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Stanley Hotel had firmly established itself as a destination for those seeking the grandeur of the mountains without sacrificing comfort. Yet, alongside its reputation for elegance, it had begun to cultivate a darker mystique. Even in these early days, guests spoke of the strange energy that lingered in the hotel. Some reported hearing faint music playing from the ballroom late at night, despite the room being empty. Others claimed to see fleeting shadows moving through the hallways or the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridors when no one was there. But for all these oddities, the hotel continued to thrive. People came for the beauty of the mountains, the comfort of the hotel, and the stories that seemed to come to life within its walls. Whether they believed in the hauntings or not, the Stanley Hotel offered something that no other place could, an experience that lingered long after you left. And so, the seeds of the Stanley Hotel's haunted legacy were planted, growing alongside its reputation as a destination for the rich and famous. As the years passed, the reputation of the Stanley Hotel grew, not only as a luxurious mountain retreat, but also as a place where the past seemed to linger in unsettling ways. The early whispers of strange sensations and eerie feelings soon gave way to more concrete accounts, stories of ghostly encounters that couldn't be easily explained. And as with all great tales, the more these stories spread, the more they grew. By the mid-20th century, the hotel had become known not just for its elegance, but for the ghosts that seemed to walk its halls. Of all the ghostly tales that surround the Stanley Hotel, none is as famous as that of room 217, the explosion that had rocked the room in 1911, injuring chambermaid Elizabeth Wilson, had left a mark that many believe persisted long after the physical damage was repaired. Elizabeth Wilson was a dedicated employee, and after her recovery from the explosion, she returned to the hotel to continue her work. But as the years went on, it seemed that her attachment to the Stanley was stronger than anyone had realized. After her passing, guests staying in room 217 began to experience odd, unexplained phenomena, things that could no longer be written off as tricks of the imagination. Visitors who stayed in the room reported feeling an unusual presence, as though someone was watching over them. It wasn't a menacing feeling, but rather a maternal, almost protective energy. Guests would wake to find their suitcases mysteriously unpacked, their clothes neatly folded, or the bed covers smoothed and tucked as if an invisible hand had been at work. Some reported waking in the middle of the night to see a woman standing at the foot of their bed, only for her to vanish as soon as they blinked. Others spoke of lights flickering on and off or hearing faint, disembodied footsteps echoing in the room when no one was around. Though unsettling, these encounters rarely felt threatening. Many who stayed in room 217 believed that the spirit of Elizabeth Wilson remained in the hotel, still dutifully tending to the needs of the guests, ensuring that their stay was as comfortable as possible, just as she had done in life. This room quickly became one of the hotel's most requested accommodations, attracting thrill seekers and ghost enthusiasts alike. For those brave enough to spend a night in room 217, the hope of encountering Elizabeth's lingering spirit was as much a draw as the luxurious surroundings. But room 217 wasn't the only place where strange things happened. In fact, the entire hotel seemed to be filled with the remnants of its past. Longtime employees and guests alike began to report a wide variety of unexplained events, turning the Stanley into a hotspot for those fascinated by the paranormal. The Grand Ballroom, once the site of many lavish parties and gatherings, became a focal point for ghostly activity. Late at night, when the ballroom was dark and empty, people claimed to hear faint music playing, as if an invisible orchestra were performing for an audience that had long since departed. Staff would hear laughter and the clinking of glasses, though no one could be seen in the room. In the hallways, guests reported hearing children's laughter and the sound of little footsteps running, though no children were staying at the hotel. This wasn't the only time ghostly children made their presence known. Visitors to the Stanley often reported seeing shadowy figures of young boys or girls darting around corners, only to disappear when approached. One of the most notable spirits said to haunt the halls of the Stanley Hotel is that of a man dressed in formal wear, often seen lingering near the hotel's bar. This figure, described as tall and distinguished, is believed to be none other than F.O. Stanley himself. Guests who've encountered him say that he offers them a nod of approval, as though still taking pride in the hotel he built, before vanishing into thin air. The presence of these spirits wasn't restricted to just the famous rooms or public spaces. Many guests reported feeling cold spots in the halls, or the sensation of being watched when they were alone. Doors would open and close by themselves. Lights would flicker, and objects would sometimes move of their own accord. Even the hotel staff, many of whom had worked there for decades, couldn't deny that something unexplainable seemed to be happening. Among the many ghost stories told about the Stanley Hotel, one of the most persistent revolves around the fourth floor. In the early days of the hotel, the fourth floor was where female employees, children, and nannies would stay. It was said to have been the site of many sleepless nights, as children would run up and down the halls, playing games and laughing. Now, the laughter of those long-gone children is said to echo through the halls once more. Guests who stay on the fourth floor often report hearing the sounds of children giggling, playing, and sometimes even crying late at night, though no children are present. The sound of small feet running along the floorboards has been heard by many, and some guests have even claimed to see the apparitions of young children darting through the shadows. But the children aren't the only ones said to haunt the fourth floor. Some guests have reported waking up in the middle of the night to find themselves tucked in bed so tightly that they could hardly move, as if someone had come to check on them while they slept. This odd and unsettling experience, though seemingly harmless, has been reported frequently enough to become a hallmark of a stay on the fourth floor. It's also not uncommon for guests to hear the faint sound of an old-fashioned elevator in use, even when the elevator itself is completely still. The creaking of doors and the rattling of chains add to the eerie atmosphere, as though the ghosts of the hotel's past are still going about their daily routines. One particularly eerie tale that has emerged from the Stanley Hotel involves an unseen entity that seems to enjoy watching the living go about their day. Guests have reported feeling an overwhelming sensation of being watched, especially when alone in their rooms or walking through the quieter parts of the hotel. One chilling story comes from a guest who stayed in one of the hotel's more remote rooms. As they lay in bed one night, they had the distinct feeling that someone or something was watching them from the corner of the room. At first, they dismissed it as their imagination playing tricks, but the feeling grew stronger, so much so that they couldn't shake the sensation of eyes upon them. When they finally worked up the courage to turn on the light and look, there was, of course, no one there. But the sensation of being watched lingered for the rest of the night, preventing them from sleeping. Such reports are common at the Stanley Hotel, with many visitors describing similar experiences. While these encounters rarely escalate beyond a feeling of unease, they contribute to the hotel's haunted reputation, as though the spirits of the Stanley's past still take an interest in the living, silently observing their every move. As the ghost stories continued to pile up, the Stanley Hotel's reputation as a haunted destination only grew. F.O. Stanley himself had passed away in 1940, but his legacy and, according to some, his presence remained strong. His vision of the Stanley as a luxurious getaway in the heart of the mountains had been realized. But now it was something more. The hotel had become a place where the past and the present seemed to blend, where the veil between the living and the dead was thin enough that, on certain nights, the two could almost touch. By the 1960s, the Stanley Hotel had gained a reputation as one of the most haunted places in the United States, drawing curious visitors eager to catch a glimpse of the otherworldly. Paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers flocked to its doors, each hoping for a brush with the unknown. Little did they know, the real transformation of the Stanley Hotel's haunted reputation was still yet to come. By the 1970s, the Stanley Hotel had already established a strong reputation for being haunted. Stories of ghostly encounters and unexplained occurrences were a part of the hotel's mystique, attracting curious visitors eager to experience its strange atmosphere firsthand. However, it wasn't until a particular guest arrived in 1974 that the hotel's reputation would be cemented on the world stage. This guest was none other than Stephen King, a man whose encounter with the hotel would inspire one of the most iconic horror novels of all time, The Shining. In late 1974, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha were living in Boulder, Colorado, while King worked on a novel that wasn't progressing the way he had hoped. Seeking inspiration, they decided to take a break and headed to the mountains for a short getaway. As they drove through Estes Park, they came upon the Stanley Hotel, a grand structure perched against the backdrop of the Rockies. At the time, the hotel was nearing the end of its season, and they managed to book a room for the night, room 217. Upon their arrival, they found that the Stanley Hotel was eerily quiet. The staff was preparing to close the hotel for the winter, and King and his wife were the only guests staying in the enormous building. As they explored the empty halls and vast, echoing spaces, the sense of isolation grew. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional creak or distant whisper of wind through the mountains. That night, after an unsettling dinner in the cavernous dining room, King and his wife retired to room 217. While Tabitha fell asleep quickly, King found himself unable to rest. The isolation of the hotel, combined with its strange and haunting atmosphere, weighed heavily on him. As he wandered the empty corridors, his imagination began to spin stories. It was during that sleepless night that King had a vivid and terrifying dream. In it, his young son was running down the hotel's hallways, looking back over his shoulder, eyes wide with fear. Something unseen and malevolent was chasing him, and King, as a helpless bystander, watched as his son screamed and ran, unable to escape the inevitable. King woke up with his heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Shaken by the intensity of the dream, King got out of bed, lit a cigarette, and stood by the window of room 217, staring out into the dark night. As he gazed over the hotel grounds, the seed of an idea began to take shape in his mind. The isolation, the overwhelming presence of the building, and the feeling of something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. All of these elements converged in that moment, sparking the creation of The Shining. By the time King left the Stanley Hotel the next morning, the outline of the novel was clear in his mind. The story would center on a family staying in an isolated hotel, where the forces of the building itself would begin to unravel the sanity of the father, ultimately leading to horror and violence. When The Shining was published in 1977, it quickly became one of Stephen King's most celebrated works. The novel tells the story of Jack Torrance, a struggling writer who takes a job as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, a remote, eerie resort that becomes the setting for his slow descent into madness. Alongside Jack are his wife Wendy and his young son Danny, who possesses psychic abilities, or The Shining, which allows him to sense the malevolent presence within the hotel. While the Overlook Hotel in the novel was a fictional creation, it was heavily inspired by King's stay at the Stanley Hotel. The long, empty halls, the remote mountain setting, and the feeling of isolation all mirrored King's experience in Estes Park. Even Room 217 played a significant role in both the novel and the real-life hauntings, with King's night in the room serving as the spark for some of the novel's most chilling scenes. The Shining was an instant success, cementing King's reputation as one of the greatest horror writers of his generation. But more importantly for the Stanley Hotel, the book brought with it an avalanche of attention. Readers flocked to Estes Park, eager to see the hotel that had inspired the terrifying Overlook. The 1980 film adaptation of The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Jack Nicholson, further propelled the hotel into the public consciousness. Although the film was not shot at the Stanley Hotel, the connection to King's novel ensured that the real-life hotel became a mecca for fans of the story. Visitors wanted to experience firsthand the place that had given birth to one of horror's most iconic settings. As word of Stephen King's connection to the Stanley Hotel spread, the hotel's ghost stories began to evolve. The existing tales of hauntings, Elizabeth Wilson in Room 217, the phantom children on the 4th floor, and the shadowy figures in the hallways became intertwined with King's fictional narrative. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and visitors to the hotel often couldn't tell where the real ghost stories ended and King's horror masterpiece began. For many, the Stanley Hotel and the Overlook Hotel became one and the same. Guests would arrive at the Stanley expecting to encounter the terrifying forces described in The Shining, and the hotel's existing reputation for being haunted only added fuel to the fire. The eerie, empty halls and strange occurrences that had been reported for decades took on a new, more sinister tone in the wake of King's novel. The hotel leaned into this new identity, hosting events and tours that capitalized on its connection to The Shining. The annual Halloween Ball, ghost tours, and paranormal-themed events all drew crowds of horror fans, eager to experience the place that had inspired such fear. Even today, the hotel's ghost tours are among its most popular attractions, with visitors hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal. With the rise of Stephen King's fame and the increased attention on the Stanley Hotel, it wasn't long before paranormal investigators began taking a serious interest in the building. Ghost hunters, psychics, and paranormal experts flocked to the hotel, hoping to document the ghostly activity that had become so closely tied to its identity. The Stanley became a frequent feature on paranormal television shows, where investigators would spend nights in the supposedly haunted rooms, using various tools and techniques to capture evidence of spirits. Some of these investigations yielded compelling results: strange shadows captured on camera, unexplained voices recorded on audio equipment, and sudden drops in temperature in areas known for paranormal activity. Room 217, in particular, became a focal point for these investigations. Many claimed to have captured the spirit of Elizabeth Wilson on film or audio, while others reported personal experiences of objects moving, doors opening on their own, or the sensation of being touched by an invisible presence. The ballroom and the 4th floor also proved to be hotspots for paranormal activity, with investigators reporting eerie music, footsteps, and the distinct feeling of being watched. Despite the scientific equipment used, many of these occurrences remained unexplained, only adding to the allure and mystery surrounding the Stanley Hotel. As more and more people began to flock to the Stanley Hotel, drawn in by the stories of hauntings and its connection to The Shining, the hotel's reputation as a haunted location solidified. For many visitors, the ghosts of the Stanley were as real as the building itself, a part of its identity as much as its grand architecture or stunning mountain views. The interplay between Stephen King's fictional horrors and the real-life hauntings of the Stanley created a unique experience for those who visited. Some came expecting to encounter the terrifying forces described in The Shining, while others hoped for a glimpse of the real ghosts said to haunt the hotel. But for many, the distinction between the two had become irrelevant. The Stanley Hotel was a place where the past, both real and imagined, seemed to come alive, where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between fiction and reality, were paper-thin. And it was this fusion of horror fiction and paranormal history that would ensure the Stanley Hotel's place as one of the most famous haunted destinations in the world. As the Stanley Hotel's reputation grew, the building's paranormal activity became a major draw for visitors from around the world. People were no longer simply interested in the hotel's history or its grand architecture. They wanted to experience its ghosts firsthand. The rise of paranormal television shows in the early 2000s turned the Stanley Hotel into a central figure in the global fascination with the supernatural. Investigators, thrill seekers, and curious tourists flocked to the hotel in search of proof of life after death, further entwining the Stanley's fate with the world of the unexplained. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Stanley Hotel had fully embraced its reputation as a haunted destination. With Stephen King's The Shining still casting a long shadow, the demand for ghost tours and paranormal experiences grew. The hotel began offering ghost-themed tours that took visitors to the most haunted areas of the building, including Room 217, the fourth floor, the Grand Ballroom, and the basement where employees had long reported strange occurrences. These tours were filled with stories of unexplained events, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing without cause, and guests experiencing eerie sensations. For those willing to stay overnight, the allure of possibly encountering a spirit became the main attraction. Many visitors would bring their own recording devices, hoping to capture voices or strange sounds, while others would take photos in the hope of catching a glimpse of something supernatural. Some guests reported waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of disembodied voices or the sensation of someone or something sitting on the edge of their bed. Others claimed to have seen full-bodied apparitions, including the ghostly figure of a woman in old-fashioned attire gliding silently through the halls, or children's laughter echoing faintly down the corridors. These experiences were rarely malicious, but they left a lasting impression on those who encountered them. In 2006, the Stanley Hotel reached a new level of fame when it was featured on the popular paranormal investigation show Ghost Hunters. The show's team of investigators spent several nights in the hotel, using their advanced equipment to try and document paranormal activity. Their investigation focused on several key areas: the famously haunted Room 217, the ballroom, the tunnels beneath the hotel, and the fourth floor, which had long been associated with the sounds of children's laughter and footsteps. During the investigation, the Ghost Hunters team reported several compelling pieces of evidence. In one instance, they captured a mysterious female voice in an empty room, and in another, they recorded what appeared to be the sound of children playing in a hallway, despite the fact that no children were staying at the hotel at the time. In the ballroom, they documented sudden temperature drops and strange light anomalies, as if something unseen was moving through the space. One of the most talked about moments came when one of the team members felt as though they had been touched by an invisible hand while standing in the basement. Though the sensation was fleeting, it was powerful enough to convince the investigators that the hotel's reputation was more than just legend. The Ghost Hunters episode catapulted the Stanley Hotel into the mainstream, drawing in an entirely new audience of ghost enthusiasts and paranormal fans. For many, the evidence captured during the show's investigation confirmed what they had long suspected, that the Stanley Hotel was home to something otherworldly. With its rising status as a paranormal hotspot, the Stanley Hotel began to host a series of events that catered specifically to the paranormal community. These included ghost hunting conferences, where amateur and professional investigators could gather to discuss their experiences, share evidence, and participate in investigations of the hotel. These conferences, often held over several days, featured guest speakers, including well-known paranormal experts, authors, and even psychics who claim to have communicated with the spirits of the hotel. Attendees would be given special access to the hotel's most haunted areas, allowing them to conduct their own investigations late into the night. The hotel also began to offer paranormal workshops, where participants could learn how to use ghost hunting equipment such as electromagnetic field (EMF) meters, thermal cameras, and voice recorders. These workshops allowed even casual visitors to experience the thrill of ghost hunting, adding a layer of excitement to their stay at the Stanley. In addition to conferences, the hotel hosted special events during Halloween, its busiest time of year. The Stanley's annual Halloween Ball became a highlight of the season, attracting hundreds of guests dressed in elaborate costumes, many inspired by characters from The Shining or the hotel's own ghost stories. The event featured live music, performances, and of course, ghost tours that extended late into the night, giving guests the chance to celebrate in the midst of the hotel's supposed spirits. As more people began visiting the Stanley Hotel with the express purpose of encountering the paranormal, the number of ghost stories associated with the hotel grew. Both guests and employees contributed to the ever-expanding collection of eerie tales, and many claim to have documented their experiences. One of the most commonly reported phenomena involved unexplained noises in the hotel's hallways, particularly on the fourth floor. Guests would often hear the sound of children running and laughing late at night, only to open their doors and find the hallway empty. Some visitors even reported hearing the sound of bouncing balls, though no one could ever find the source of the noise. The Grand Ballroom, long associated with ghostly activity, also continued to be a hotspot. Many staff members claimed to have heard the faint sound of a piano playing when the room was empty. One story told of a maintenance worker who had entered the ballroom to turn off the lights, only to find a lone figure standing at the far end of the room. The figure, dressed in formal attire from another era, reportedly stared at the worker before fading away into the shadows. Room 217, thanks to its association with both Stephen King and the ghost of Elizabeth Wilson, remained the most requested room in the hotel. Guests who stayed in the room reported a variety of strange experiences, from the sensation of being watched to the inexplicable movement of objects within the room. One guest recalled waking up in the middle of the night to find their suitcase neatly unpacked with their clothes folded and placed on the bed, even though they had left everything in disarray before falling asleep. The hotel's basement and tunnels, which had been used by staff in the early days to move around the hotel unnoticed, were another area of interest for paranormal investigators. Some claim to have heard the sound of footsteps following them through the narrow tunnels, while others reported feeling sudden cold drafts or hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One of the most enduring ghost stories associated with the Stanley Hotel is that of F.O. Stanley himself. Many guests and staff members have reported seeing the hotel's founder walking through the halls, often dressed in a suit and tie as he oversees the hotel he built. His ghost is most frequently seen near the bar, where he is said to stand and watch over the guests with a calm, dignified air. Unlike some of the other spirits said to haunt the hotel, F.O. Stanley's presence is often described as comforting rather than frightening. Guests who have encountered his spirit claim that they felt reassured, as though the hotel's founder was still taking pride in his creation and ensuring that it was running smoothly. One particularly famous account came from a group of tourists who were visiting the hotel as part of a ghost tour. As they passed by the bar, one of the women in the group spotted a man sitting at the bar, dressed in formal attire. She mentioned him to the tour guide, who turned to look only to find the bar completely empty. Though these sightings are rare, they contribute to the overall sense that the Stanley Hotel is a place where the past continues to linger, where the spirits of those who helped shape its history remain tied to the building, ensuring that their legacy endures. By the mid-2000s, The Stanley Hotel had solidified its place as one of the world's most famous haunted destinations. The combination of its real-life hauntings, its connection to The Shining, and its embrace of the paranormal community ensured that the hotel would continue to attract visitors eager to experience the supernatural. From ghost tours to paranormal investigations, the Stanley offered a unique blend of history, luxury, and the chance to encounter something otherworldly. For many, a visit to the Stanley Hotel wasn't just a vacation. It was an opportunity to step into a world where the lines between the living and the dead blurred, where the echoes of the past could still be heard in the quiet moments of the night. In the present day, the Stanley Hotel stands as more than just a luxurious mountain retreat. It has evolved into a place where history, legend, and the supernatural coexist in a delicate balance, attracting visitors from all walks of life. Some come for its stunning views of the Rocky Mountains, others for the comfort of its stately rooms, but many come for the ghosts and the thrill of the unknown. Over a century after its doors first opened, the Stanley Hotel has become a living monument to its own paranormal legacy. Throughout its long history, the Stanley Hotel has undergone numerous renovations to maintain its grand appearance. However, these changes have done little to diminish the hotel's otherworldly charm. In fact, many believe that renovations may have only stirred up more paranormal activity. It's a common belief among ghost hunters and psychics that when buildings are disrupted, so too are the spirits that dwell within them. The Stanley's ongoing efforts to update its facilities have been met with increased reports of strange occurrences. One of the most significant renovations came in the early 2010s, when the Stanley underwent a major refurbishment to restore its historical grandeur while adding modern amenities. During this process, construction workers reported seeing figures out of the corners of their eyes, only to find no one there upon closer inspection. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. Some workers even claimed to have heard their names whispered when they were alone in empty rooms. Even after these updates, the Stanley remained committed to its haunted reputation. In 2015, the hotel announced plans to build a state-of-the-art film center and horror museum dedicated to the genre that had cemented the hotel's place in popular culture. Although the project has faced delays and setbacks, the idea of a permanent tribute to horror, and particularly to The Shining, speaks to the way the Stanley has embraced its identity as a haunted landmark. The museum's vision includes memorabilia from iconic horror films, exhibitions about the history of the genre, and even a space for paranormal investigations. This venture represents a bold step forward for the Stanley, cementing its place not just as a historical site, but as a cultural destination for horror fans and ghost enthusiasts alike. Decades after its release, Stephen King's The Shining continues to loom large over the Stanley Hotel. Visitors come from all over the world, drawn by the connection to King's novel and Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film adaptation. While Kubrick's version of The Shining was filmed elsewhere, the Stanley Hotel remains the spiritual home of the Overlook Hotel in the minds of many fans. The hotel has fully embraced this legacy, offering special events and tours that focus on its connection to the novel. Fans of King's work can book stays in room 217, the room where King himself stayed and the setting of a pivotal moment in the novel. The hotel also offers a Shining-themed tour, where guests are taken to the locations that inspired key moments in the story. Guides share behind-the-scenes insights into King's visit, as well as the ways the real-life hotel differs from the fictional Overlook. However, the Stanley Hotel has made an effort to distinguish itself from the darker elements of The Shining. While the Overlook in King's novel is a place of malevolent spirits and madness, the Stanley's ghosts are typically described as playful or mischievous, rather than evil. The hotel prides itself on being a place where guests can experience the thrill of the supernatural without the terror that accompanies the Overlook. This careful balance between embracing its fictional legacy and maintaining its own identity has helped the Stanley attract both casual visitors and die-hard fans of King's work. It's a delicate line to walk, but the hotel has managed to carve out a unique space for itself in the world of horror and the paranormal. In recent years, the Stanley Hotel has become a popular destination for couples seeking an unconventional wedding venue. The combination of luxury and the supernatural offers a unique backdrop for those looking to tie the knot. Wedding ceremonies are often held on the hotel's sprawling grounds, with the majestic Rocky Mountains providing a breathtaking view. However, it's the haunted reputation of the hotel that often becomes a memorable part of these events. Many couples choose to embrace the hotel's ghostly charm, incorporating it into their wedding themes. Some brides and grooms have even reported unexplained phenomena during their ceremonies or receptions, objects moving on their own, strange cold spots in the ballroom, or fleeting figures captured in wedding photos. For those fascinated by the paranormal, these occurrences add an unforgettable layer to their special day. In addition to weddings, the Stanley Hotel hosts a variety of events throughout the year that cater to its ghostly allure. From Halloween parties to murder mystery dinners, these events draw in crowds eager to experience the hotel's eerie atmosphere. The Stanley's annual Halloween Ball is a particularly popular event, with guests dressing in elaborate costumes and partaking in ghost tours and paranormal-themed activities. It's a night where the veil between the living and the supernatural seems especially thin, and many attendees leave with their own stories of unexplained encounters. Despite the wealth of ghost stories that surround the Stanley Hotel, not everyone is convinced that the hotel is truly haunted. Some skeptics argue that the hotel's reputation is built on folklore and the power of suggestion. They claim that visitors who come to the Stanley expecting to experience paranormal activity are more likely to interpret everyday occurrences, such as creaky floorboards or sudden drafts, as ghostly phenomena. Skeptics point to the fact that many of the hotel's ghost stories have no clear historical basis. For example, there's little documented evidence to suggest that Elizabeth Wilson, the chambermaid associated with room 217, actually haunts the hotel. Similarly, the stories of children's laughter on the fourth floor and ghostly figures in the ballroom often lack concrete evidence to support their claims. However, for every skeptic, there is a believer who insists that the Stanley Hotel is indeed haunted. These believers often point to their own personal experiences as proof. They speak of feelings of being watched, objects moving on their own, or sudden, unexplained cold spots. Some even claim to have captured photographic evidence of spirits' blurry figures, orbs of light, or shadowy shapes that appear in their photos without explanation. For many, the truth about the Stanley Hotel lies somewhere in between. Whether or not the hotel is genuinely haunted, there is no denying the power of its reputation. The stories that have accumulated over the years have taken on a life of their own, becoming an integral part of the hotel's identity. Beyond its haunted reputation, the Stanley Hotel has found a place in popular culture. In addition to its connection to The Shining, the hotel has been featured in numerous television shows, documentaries, and films. Its grand architecture and eerie history make it a compelling location for filmmakers and storytellers alike. The hotel has been featured on paranormal investigation shows such as Ghost Adventures, Most Haunted, and Paranormal Witness, with investigators attempting to capture evidence of the spirits that are said to roam its halls. These shows have only added to the Stanley's mystique, drawing in fans of the paranormal who are eager to see the hotel for themselves. In addition to television, the Stanley Hotel has inspired countless books, articles, and online content. From ghost hunting blogs to fan fiction inspired by The Shining, the hotel continues to capture the imaginations of people around the world. Its unique blend of history, horror, and the supernatural ensures that it will remain a subject of fascination for years to come. As the Stanley Hotel moves into its second century, it remains one of the most famous haunted locations in the world. For some, it is a place of luxury and relaxation, a beautiful retreat nestled in the Rocky Mountains. For others, it is a place of mystery and intrigue, where the past continues to echo through the halls, and the spirits of those long gone still make their presence known. Whether visitors come for the ghost stories, the stunning views, or the connection to The Shining, the Stanley Hotel offers an experience unlike any other. It is a place where history and the supernatural converge, creating a unique atmosphere that leaves a lasting impression on all who visit. For over a century, the Stanley Hotel has stood as a testament to the power of storytelling, and its legacy will continue to grow, fueled by the whispers of ghosts and the thrill of the unknown. And for those brave enough to spend the night, the Stanley Hotel offers a simple challenge. Do you believe? The story of the Crying Boy painting begins in post-war Europe, where tragedy and hardship had become an integral part of everyday life. Among the many artists who sought to express the collective emotions of the time, one figure stood out: Giovanni Bragolin, an Italian painter who became known for his haunting portrayal of a young boy, tears streaking down his face. But the origins of this now infamous artwork were far more complicated and, as some would claim, much darker than initially believed. Born as Bruno Amadio in Venice in 1911, Bragolin was deeply affected by the devastation of World War II. His early life was marked by the poverty and emotional toll that spread throughout Italy during the conflict. As an artist, he was drawn to subjects that conveyed deep emotion, focusing on the human experience of suffering and despair. By the late 1950s, Bragolin had created a series of paintings that featured children in distress, but none would become as famous or notorious as The Crying Boy. This painting depicted a young boy, likely no older than 6 or 7, with large, sorrowful eyes gazing directly at the viewer. His expression was heartbreaking, a mixture of fear and grief, and his cheeks were stained with tears. It was a striking image, one that evoked strong emotions in anyone who saw it. The boy's clothing was simple, suggesting a life of poverty, and the muted background only heightened the intensity of his sad face. Though the identity of the boy remains a mystery, many stories circulated regarding his background. Some believed that the child was an orphan, wandering the streets of war-torn Italy, while others speculated that he had lost his family in a fire. These rumors, although never confirmed, contributed to the painting's eerie reputation. Bragolin sold his painting to a British publisher in the 1960s, and it was mass-produced, making its way into thousands of homes across Europe and beyond. This widespread distribution helped cement The Crying Boy as a household name, though few knew anything about the artist or the story behind the boy's tears. At first, the painting was seen as nothing more than a sentimental piece of art, popular for its ability to evoke strong emotions. Yet, as more people acquired copies of The Crying Boy, strange events began to occur, events that would lead to whispers of something far more sinister than a mere painting. For many, the sorrow captured in The Crying Boy spoke to a universal experience: loss, hardship, and the fragility of life. Post-war Europe was still healing from the scars of conflict, and the image of a child in distress resonated deeply with a public that had witnessed unimaginable destruction. The tears of the boy seemed to represent the sorrow of a generation, one that had been irrevocably changed by the horrors of war. Art critics at the time suggested that the painting might also reflect Bragolin's personal trauma. Having lived through the war himself, Bragolin had experienced the same pain and grief as many of his subjects. Some believe that the artist infused his own emotional scars into the painting, using the image of the crying boy as a means to process his inner turmoil. Others saw the boy's expression as a symbol of innocence lost, a poignant reminder of how children were often the most vulnerable in times of crisis. As the painting gained popularity, so did the intrigue surrounding the boy himself. Though Bragelin never officially revealed the identity of his model, rumors began to spread. Some claimed the boy had been abandoned by his family, left to fend for himself in a harsh world. Others whispered that he was a survivor of a tragic accident, possibly a fire, which explained his sorrowful expression. These stories, though unsubstantiated, added to the painting's mystique. A particularly persistent rumor suggested that the boy had passed away under tragic circumstances, which fueled the idea that the painting was cursed. According to some versions of the story, Bragelin had taken in the orphan boy, only for the child to later perish in a mysterious incident. Whether or not this story held any truth, it began to influence the way people viewed the painting. No longer was it merely a depiction of sadness. It had become something far more unsettling, a potential harbinger of misfortune. By the mid-1970s, The Crying Boy had reached peak popularity in the United Kingdom. Art reproductions of the piece could be found in homes across the country, often hanging in living rooms or hallways. Its mass production meant that it was easily accessible to the general public, and it was often sold as a decorative piece in department stores. For many, the painting was simply an emotional portrait of a child in distress, a reminder of the hardships of life. Yet, as time went on, an increasing number of people began to associate the painting with a string of inexplicable incidents. Around the same time, reports began to surface of mysterious fires breaking out in homes where the painting was displayed. These incidents were particularly strange because in each case, the house would suffer extensive damage, but the painting itself would emerge unscathed. Firefighters, homeowners, and journalists alike were baffled by the phenomenon. Was it simply a coincidence, or was there something more sinister at play? In 1985, a British tabloid newspaper, The Sun, published a sensational story about a series of house fires that had occurred across the country. The headline read, "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy," and the article detailed how homes with the painting had been reduced to ashes, while the artwork itself remained untouched by the flames. The article sparked widespread panic, and many people who owned copies of The Crying Boy rushed to get rid of the painting, either destroying it or passing it on to others. Thus, the painting's reputation as a cursed object began to take hold. The legend of the Crying Boy quickly spread, and soon it wasn't just the painting's eerie resilience to fire that concerned people. Some began to claim that the painting brought bad luck in general, attributing any misfortune they experienced to its presence in their home. Accidents, illnesses, and financial hardships were all blamed on the painting, as it took on a life of its own in the public's imagination. What had started as a simple work of art had now become a symbol of fear and mystery. But the question remained, was the curse real, or was it merely the product of coincidence and superstition? As the years went on, more and more people would attempt to answer that question, leading to a mix of skepticism, fear, and fascination that persists to this day. As the years passed, the Crying Boy painting became more than just a visual representation of sorrow. In the 1980s, strange and inexplicable events began to unfold around it, turning what was once a piece of art into something much more sinister in the public eye. The idea of a curse began to take shape, and soon enough, fear spread like wildfire. It all started with a string of house fires that seemed to defy explanation. Families who had innocently hung the painting in their homes began to report disastrous fires that engulfed their houses. In each of these incidents, the fire consumed nearly everything in its path: furniture, curtains, walls, yet, without fail, the Crying Boy painting would remain untouched, its image of sorrowful innocence emerging from the wreckage unscathed. One of the earliest known incidents took place in a small English town in 1985, where a firefighter named Alan Wilkinson was called to a house fire. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the blaze had reduced much of the home to ash. Yet, as Wilkinson and his team sifted through the remains, they found something startling. There, Hanging on a charred wall was the crying boy painting, perfectly intact. It seemed impossible that the painting had survived the inferno when everything else had been destroyed. At first, Wilkinson thought little of it. It was an odd occurrence, but fires often behaved in unpredictable ways. However, as he continued his work in the area, he began to notice a pattern. Over the next few months, Wilkinson responded to several more house fires, and in each case, the same disturbing detail emerged. The crying boy was found amidst the ruins unharmed. As the incidents piled up, Wilkinson couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to these fires than mere coincidence. It wasn't long before others began to notice the strange pattern as well. Reports surfaced from across the United Kingdom of homes that had been devastated by fire, with the crying boy painting always surviving the destruction. Homeowners, firefighters, and even some insurance agents started to share their stories, each adding to the growing sense of unease. In September of 1985, British tabloid newspaper The Sun ran a sensational headline that would ignite widespread panic: "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." The article recounted a series of house fires, all linked by one common factor: the presence of the crying boy painting. The story detailed how one family, the Hall family of Rotherham, had suffered a devastating fire that destroyed their home. In a twist that mirrored the earlier incidents, their crying boy painting remained unharmed. In the article, Ron Hall, the father, recounted how he had hung the painting in his living room as a gift from a friend, never suspecting the misfortune it would bring. The story quickly went viral in the pre-internet sense, stoking fears across the nation. The Sun even claimed that firefighters had warned people to get rid of their crying boy paintings, believing that the artwork was somehow tied to the recurring fires. This statement, while never officially confirmed by fire departments, spread like wildfire itself. People across the country began to dispose of the painting, some burning it in hopes of breaking the so-called curse, while others went so far as to abandon it in fields or dump it in the trash. The media frenzy around the crying boy painting only fueled the legend, amplifying the sense of dread that now surrounded the artwork. From that point on, the painting was no longer seen as a simple piece of art, but as a potential source of misfortune. People who had once admired its emotional depth now saw it as a ticking time bomb, waiting to bring disaster into their lives. Following the Sun's article, an influx of personal testimonies flooded the newspaper's editorial offices. Dozens of readers shared their own experiences with the crying boy, many of them eerily similar to the Hall family's ordeal. One couple from Nottingham reported that, after hanging the painting in their home, a fire had broken out in their kitchen under mysterious circumstances. Though their home suffered extensive damage, the painting remained unharmed, just like in the other cases. Another chilling account came from a family in East London. After purchasing a reproduction of the crying boy, they claimed that a series of strange occurrences began to plague their household. Electrical appliances would malfunction for no apparent reason. Light bulbs would burst unexpectedly, and the family dog, normally calm, became agitated whenever it was near the painting. Eventually, the family experienced a small fire in their living room, which, as expected, left the crying boy untouched. It wasn't just ordinary people who reported strange experiences. A pub owner in the Midlands recounted how, after displaying the painting in his establishment, the building was struck by a freak fire. Once again, the painting survived while much of the interior was destroyed. With each new story, the painting's reputation grew more terrifying, and the idea that it was cursed became embedded in the public consciousness. As the legend of the crying boy grew, so did the need for an explanation. Many believed the painting was haunted by the spirit of the boy it depicted, though there was no definitive proof that the boy had ever existed. Some claimed that the child had been a victim of abuse or neglect, and that his soul had somehow become trapped in the artwork, seeking revenge on those who possessed it. This theory, while dramatic, lacked any real evidence and was largely based on speculation. Others suggested that the painting itself was cursed, not by the boy, but by the artist. Some people speculated that Giovanni Bragolin had inadvertently imbued the painting with dark energy due to his own emotional suffering while creating it. Others believed the curse was intentional, though this theory was even less credible. Bragolin, after all, had no known ties to the occult or any practices that could explain such a malevolent force. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the idea of the curse took on a life of its own. Paranormal investigators were called in to examine the painting and the stories surrounding it. Some claimed to detect an evil presence in the painting, while others dismissed the entire affair as nothing more than mass hysteria. The scientific community, for its part, remained skeptical, with most experts arguing that the so-called curse was nothing more than coincidence. As the curse story gained momentum, fear spread far and wide. People who had never experienced a house fire began to worry that merely owning the painting could bring them bad luck. Superstition surrounding the painting grew, with some individuals going to great lengths to avoid any association with it. Charity shops that once sold reproductions of the crying boy started refusing to accept donations of the painting, while others put up signs warning customers of the alleged curse. For many, the decision to part with the painting was driven by fear of the unknown. Even those who didn't fully believe in the curse found themselves unwilling to take the risk, and stories of people discarding or destroying their crying boy reproductions became commonplace. The painting's fate became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of modern superstition in a world that often struggled to reconcile the rational with the unexplained. By the mid-1980s, the crying boy painting had transcended its role as a simple piece of art. It had become a cultural phenomenon, deeply embedded in the public psyche. As the stories of house fires and misfortunes circulated widely, they fueled a collective fear, turning the painting from an object of sorrow into a symbol of dread. But how did a single painting come to have such a profound psychological impact on so many people? And what was it about the cursed narrative that made it spread so quickly across communities? To understand the broader obsession with the crying boy, we must delve into the psychology of fear and how superstition shapes human behavior. The painting, through its association with misfortune, tapped into deep-seated anxieties, both personal and societal, and it became a focal point for cultural obsession. One of the most compelling aspects of the crying boy curse was the fear of the unknown that it represented. For many, the idea of a painting causing disasters was both absurd and terrifying, precisely because it defied logical explanation. Fires in particular are universally feared due to their destructive nature, and the image of a painting surviving such devastation was unsettling to say the least. Psychologists often explain this type of fear as a response to events that feel uncontrollable. The mind, seeking to make sense of a tragic and random occurrence, might latch onto a specific object or idea to rationalize the chaos. In the case of the crying boy, the painting became a convenient scapegoat, allowing people to attribute a cause to the unpredictable nature of house fires. Furthermore, the image itself, a crying child, elicited a strong emotional reaction. Children are symbols of innocence, vulnerability, and purity, and seeing a child in distress can provoke a deep, instinctual sense of empathy. This emotional connection to the image made the painting more memorable and, in some cases, more disturbing. The painting's sorrowful expression seemed to mirror the loss and grief experienced by those who suffered fires, reinforcing the belief that the artwork was somehow linked to their misfortune. Much of the widespread panic surrounding the crying boy can be attributed to the role of the media, particularly in how it reported on the supposed curse. When British tabloids like The Sun published sensational stories about the painting, They amplified the fear and superstition in a way that allowed it to spread quickly and unchecked. Newspapers, seeking to sell copies, often sensationalized the facts, focusing on the mysterious nature of the fires and the unbreakable curse associated with the painting. The media's framing of the story created a sense of immediacy and danger, urging readers to take action to protect themselves from the supposed curse. Headlines like "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy" struck a chord with a public already anxious about safety, and the press played a significant role in transforming the painting's reputation from a curious artwork to a feared object. The media also created a feedback loop of fear. As more people read about the painting's connection to house fires, more stories of misfortune began to emerge. Some were likely true accounts of coincidence, while others may have been exaggerated or fabricated. However, each news story reinforced the belief in the curse, leading more people to come forward with their own experiences. The spread of these stories turned the painting into a viral sensation of its time, driven not by the internet, but by word of mouth, news reports, and community whispers. Superstition has always played a role in human culture, particularly when it comes to explaining events that seem unexplainable. The concept of cursed objects is not unique to the Crying Boy painting. Throughout history, people have attributed supernatural powers to everyday items, especially those tied to tragedy or misfortune. What made the Crying Boy stand out, however, was its timing. The 1980s were a period of uncertainty for many, marked by economic struggles and the looming threat of global conflict. During such times, people often turned to superstition as a way of regaining a sense of control over their lives. The curse associated with the Crying Boy was a modern manifestation of this age-old human tendency. People wanted to believe that by removing or destroying the painting, they could protect themselves from harm, much like how people in earlier centuries would avoid walking under ladders or breaking mirrors to ward off bad luck. Psychologists refer to this behavior as magical thinking, the belief that one's actions, though irrational, can influence outcomes in ways that defy logic. In the case of the Crying Boy, the act of getting rid of the painting was a form of magical thinking. For those who believed in the curse, discarding the artwork provided a sense of relief, even if it had no actual effect on preventing misfortune. The fascination with cursed objects is deeply embedded in human culture, from ancient times to the present day. Whether it's a cursed mummy's tomb or a haunted house, objects tied to misfortune have always captured the public's imagination. They represent a blending of fear and intrigue. People are both repelled by and drawn to these items, curious about the mystery behind them, while simultaneously wary of their supposed power. The Crying Boy painting fit neatly into this cultural narrative. As the story of its curse spread, it became not just an object of fear, but one of curiosity. People who heard about the painting's supposed powers were eager to see it for themselves, even if they didn't believe in the curse. In some cases, the painting's notoriety led to an increase in demand, with some collectors seeking out copies simply for the thrill of owning a cursed item. This obsession with the Crying Boy painting reflected a broader cultural phenomenon. In the 1980s, as paranormal shows and ghost stories gained popularity, people became more interested in tales of the supernatural. The painting's curse fit perfectly into this growing fascination with the unknown, and it became a pop culture symbol of fear and intrigue. One of the most interesting aspects of the Crying Boy curse is the power of collective belief. The more people believed in the curse, the more real it became, at least in the minds of those who feared it. This phenomenon is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the belief in a certain outcome can influence actions that make that outcome more likely to occur. For example, some homeowners may have inadvertently increased the likelihood of accidents or misfortune by focusing so much on the curse. Anxiety and fear can lead to mistakes, and in a state of heightened stress, People are more likely to misinterpret ordinary events as signs of supernatural interference. A creaking floorboard, a flickering light, or an unexpected power outage could be seen as confirmation of the curse's power, when in reality, these were just normal occurrences. The more people shared their experiences and bought into the legend, the stronger the curse appeared to grow. It didn't matter that there was no scientific evidence to support the idea of a cursed painting. What mattered was that enough people believed it. In this way, the curse became a cultural reality, sustained by collective fear and imagination. As fear of the crying boy curse reached its peak, it was only a matter of time before skeptics and researchers began to challenge the legends surrounding the painting. After all, the idea that a mass-produced work of art could be responsible for house fires seemed far-fetched to many. While countless people were convinced that the painting held some sort of supernatural power, others sought rational explanations for the strange occurrences that have fueled the myth. This chapter focuses on those attempts to debunk the curse explorations carried out by scientists, journalists, and paranormal investigators, each with their own theories as to why the crying boy seemed to be at the center of so much bad luck. One of the most common efforts to debunk the curse came from within the scientific community. Experts in fire safety and physics began to look closely at the stories of fires involving the crying boy, searching for logical explanations that could account for the painting's strange survival in multiple blazes. One such theory centered around the materials used to produce the paintings. Many of the reproductions of the crying boy were printed on a type of hardboard, which is more heat-resistant than other common materials found in homes, such as paper or fabric. Additionally, some investigators found that the varnish used to seal the surface of the painting may have acted as a protective layer, allowing the artwork to withstand the heat of a fire. Fire investigators also pointed out that in some cases, the placement of the painting could explain its survival. In several instances, the painting had been hung near the door or in rooms that had not been fully engulfed by the fire. This positioning, combined with the fact that fires tend to move in specific patterns depending on ventilation, could explain why the painting often remained intact while other parts of the house were reduced to ash. Another explanation involved the peculiar phenomenon of fire shadows. In a typical house fire, objects located behind larger, more solid items can sometimes be shielded from the worst effects of the flames. This could explain why some versions of the crying boy appeared to be undamaged in fires where the rest of the room was destroyed. In these cases, heavy furniture or walls might have provided a protective barrier that kept the painting safe. Despite these scientific explanations, many believers in the curse were not swayed. For those who had experienced misfortune firsthand, the rational analysis of fire behavior and material properties did little to alleviate the sense that the painting held some deeper, malevolent force. While some sought to explain the curse through science, others turned to the paranormal for answers. Paranormal investigators, intrigued by the painting's dark reputation, began to conduct their own studies in an effort to determine whether the crying boy truly harbored supernatural energy. Several investigators claimed to detect unusual electromagnetic fields near the painting, which they suggested could be evidence of a paranormal presence. Others used tools such as dowsing rods, pendulums, and spirit boxes in their investigations, hoping to communicate with whatever spirit or force might be tied to the painting. While these methods did not provide concrete proof, they added another layer of mystery to the story, feeding into the belief that the crying boy was not just an ordinary painting. Some investigators proposed that the curse was tied to the boy depicted in the painting. One popular theory was that the boy had died tragically, either in a fire or under suspicious circumstances, and that his spirit had become trapped in the artwork. This theory, though largely unsupported by historical evidence, persisted among believers. According to this narrative, the boy's spirit was seeking vengeance or release, and those who displayed his image in their homes were unwittingly inviting misfortune. Other paranormal investigators pointed to the idea of psychometry, the belief that objects can absorb and hold the energy of past events or people. From this perspective, the painting itself might have absorbed negative energy from those who had owned it, particularly if they had experienced hardship or tragedy. This negative energy, according to believers in psychometry, could manifest in the form of the curse, causing the string of unfortunate events linked to the painting. While these theories were compelling to some, they did not hold up to rigorous scrutiny. There was no definitive evidence of paranormal activity linked to the painting, and most of the methods used by investigators were dismissed by skeptics as unreliable or unscientific. However, the lack of concrete answers did little to diminish the public's fascination with the painting. One of the most rational attempts to debunk the curse focused on the role of human psychology, specifically the tendency to attribute meaning to random events. Known as confirmation bias, this phenomenon occurs when people focus on information that supports their existing beliefs while ignoring evidence to the contrary. In the case of the crying boy, those who believed in the curse were more likely to remember and emphasize stories of house fires where the painting had survived, while ignoring the many homes with the painting that never experienced any issues. The repetition of these selective stories created the illusion of a pattern, even though there was no statistical evidence to support the idea that homes with the crying boy were any more likely to catch fire than those without it. Additionally, the curse's reputation may have been strengthened by the human tendency to connect unrelated events. For example, a homeowner who hung the painting and later experienced a fire might naturally associate the two events, even though there was no causal relationship between them. In this way, the curse became a self-reinforcing cycle, as each new incident was interpreted through the lens of the legend. Skeptics also pointed out that fires are relatively common occurrences, and the fact that several homes with the crying boy experienced fires was likely nothing more than coincidence. As fire investigators noted, the presence of a mass-produced painting in a certain number of homes meant that, statistically, it was bound to show up in houses that experienced fires sooner or later. The painting's reputation as a cursed object simply made these coincidental occurrences more memorable and alarming. A significant factor in the painting's cursed reputation was the role of media in spreading and amplifying the story. As previously noted, the British tabloids, particularly The Sun, played a major role in turning the crying boy into a nationwide phenomenon. The sensational headlines and dramatic stories published by the media gave the curse a sense of legitimacy that made it difficult for the public to dismiss. In the aftermath of the initial reports, the curse of the crying boy became a self-perpetuating media narrative. As more people came forward with their own experiences, the story continued to grow, feeding on the fear and intrigue it generated. This media-driven cycle of panic is a classic example of what sociologists refer to as mass hysteria, a phenomenon in which fear and anxiety spread rapidly through a population, often fueled by rumors and misinformation. By the time skeptics and investigators began to debunk the curse, the damage had already been done. The idea of the crying boy as a cursed object had taken root in the public imagination, and even those who did not fully believe in the curse were hesitant to dismiss it outright. After all, the risk of keeping such a painting seemed too great when weighed against the potential for disaster, however unlikely it might be. In the end, the crying boy painting serves as a powerful example of how modern folklore can take shape. What began as an ordinary piece of art became the subject of a widespread urban legend, fueled by fear, superstition, and media sensationalism. Attempts to debunk the myth, while based in logic and reason, were ultimately unable to fully dispel the belief in the curse. Like so many other legends, the story of the crying boy endures because it taps into deeper human fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of misfortune, and the fear that some things simply cannot be explained. Even today, long after the fires that made the painting infamous, the crying boy continues to intrigue and unsettle. Despite the best efforts of skeptics and investigators, the legend lives on, a reminder that some stories are more powerful than the facts that seek to disprove them. By the late 1980s, the panic surrounding the crying boy had mostly subsided. Attempts to debunk the myth, along with the passage of time, had helped ease the collective anxiety that once gripped communities in Britain and beyond. Yet despite the decrease in public fear, the legend of the crying boy refused to fade entirely. Like so many urban legends before it, the story lived on, shifting from a source of genuine terror to a curious piece of cultural history. This final chapter explores the legacy of the crying boy painting, examining how it has remained a subject of fascination in popular culture and continues to be remembered by those who lived through its infamous curse. While the hysteria may have passed, the painting has left an indelible mark on the collective memory, serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the power of folklore. As the media frenzy around the crying boy began to subside, many homeowners who once feared the painting felt more comfortable discussing their experiences. For some, the curse was now viewed with a sense of humor, an overblown story that had captivated the nation for a brief moment, only to lose its grip once the fires stopped making headlines. Others, however, remained wary. The emotional impact of the curse lingered, especially for those who had experienced personal misfortune and continued to believe in the painting's dark power. In the years following the height of the panic, many people who had once owned copies of the crying boy sought to rid themselves of the painting. Some simply discarded it, while others destroyed their copies, burning them in a symbolic act of self-protection. Stories circulated of individuals attempting to destroy the paintings, only to claim that they were unable to do so, further fueling the belief that the curse remained intact. This destruction, however, was never widespread enough to erase the painting's presence entirely. Over time, the crying boy began to fade from the forefront of public consciousness, but it never fully disappeared. The painting, with its unsettling reputation, had become a relic of its time, an object steeped in mystery, remembered for the fear it once inspired. For those who had lived through the curse, the painting's image was difficult to forget, even if they no longer believed in its supernatural power. As with many urban legends, the crying boy found new life in popular culture. In the years that followed the panic, the painting became the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions. These retellings of the curse often focused on the painting's strange journey from a mass-produced artwork to a feared object of folklore. True crime and paranormal shows, particularly those that thrived on uncovering the unexplained, frequently revisited the story, highlighting the cultural moment when the painting became a symbol of widespread unease. The legend of the crying boy also found a home on internet forums and blogs, where users debated the validity of the curse and shared their own encounters with the painting. For a younger generation, the painting became something of a curiosity, an eerie reminder of the past, but one that seemed distant and removed from their own experiences. Nonetheless, the painting's reputation for bringing misfortune continued to attract attention as new audiences encountered the story for the first time. One of the most fascinating aspects of the painting's cultural legacy is how it has shifted over time. What was once a terrifying curse has, for many, become a symbol of the irrational fears that can grip entire communities. The story of the crying boy now serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of superstition, mass hysteria, and the role of media in shaping public perception. Ironically, as fear of the crying boy painting decreased, its value as a collectible increased. What was once a common and affordable piece of decor became a sought-after item for collectors of cursed objects and paranormal memorabilia. For those interested in the occult or the supernatural, Owning a copy of The Crying Boy was a way to connect with the painting's mysterious history. Some collectors viewed it as a novelty, an object with a dark reputation that could be displayed proudly without the fear that once accompanied it. Auction sites and antique shops began to see an uptick in interest for the Crying Boy reproductions, with some copies fetching higher prices than ever before. The painting had transitioned from a feared object to a coveted item, its legacy reshaped by the very panic that had once surrounded it. For many, the desire to own a copy of the painting was tied to its cultural significance. The Crying Boy was no longer just a painting. It was a piece of modern folklore. In some cases, collectors who acquired the painting were motivated by a desire to test the curse for themselves. The legend, though largely debunked, still held enough mystery to make people wonder if there was any truth to the stories. These new owners, however, were far more likely to view the painting's curse with skepticism, turning it into a conversation piece rather than a source of anxiety. The story of the Crying Boy offers important lessons about the nature of belief, fear, and how quickly rumors can spread in times of uncertainty. At its core, the curse of the painting was never about the object itself. It was about the human need to find meaning in chaos and to explain misfortune when the world feels unpredictable. The mass panic surrounding the painting is a powerful example of how fear can take root and spread through communities, often with the help of media amplification. In the case of the Crying Boy, newspapers played a critical role in shaping the narrative, sensationalizing the story and feeding into the public's existing anxieties. This is a reminder of the media's power to influence how people perceive events, and how easily urban legends can be created when sensationalism overshadows facts. Furthermore, the story highlights the persistence of superstition in modern society. Despite advances in science and technology, the human mind is still susceptible to beliefs in the supernatural, particularly when faced with unexplained tragedies. The legend of the Crying Boy demonstrates how these beliefs can become self-perpetuating, with each new piece of evidence reinforcing the idea of a curse, even when no logical explanation exists. Ultimately, the legacy of the Crying Boy is one of both fascination and caution. While the painting no longer inspires the same level of fear as it once did, its story serves as a reminder of how quickly fear can spread and how difficult it can be to separate truth from fiction when faced with the unknown. As we reach the conclusion of the Crying Boy painting's tale, it becomes clear that the legend will continue to endure. Though the panic has long since faded, the painting's story remains an intriguing chapter in the history of modern urban legends. Even today, the image of the crying child holds a certain unsettling power, a reminder of the mystery and fear that once surrounded it. For some, the painting's legacy is a warning about the dangers of superstition and irrational fear. For others, it is a testament to the power of storytelling, illustrating how legends can grow and evolve over time. And for those who still believe in the curse, the Crying Boy remains an object of intrigue, one that will forever be associated with misfortune, mystery, and the unknown. In the end, the Crying Boy has outlived the fires that made it infamous. It has become more than just a painting. It is a piece of cultural memory, a symbol of how fear, superstition, and legend can shape the way we view the world around us. Whether feared, collected, or simply remembered, the Crying Boy will continue to captivate those who hear its story, long after the flames of its curse have been extinguished. Theodate Pope Riddle's life was anything but ordinary. Born Effie Brooks Pope in 1867 to a wealthy Connecticut family, she defied the expectations placed upon women of her era. From a young age, it was clear she was a girl who marched to the beat of her own drum, rejecting the comfortable life of privilege her family could afford. Unlike the other children of high society, who spent their days learning etiquette or fine arts, Theodate found herself drawn to architecture, much to the dismay of those around her. It wasn't just an unusual choice for a woman. It was unheard of. Her family, particularly her father Alfred, a wealthy industrialist and art collector, had hoped she would conform to a more traditional role. But Theodate was stubborn, determined, and driven by a passion for creation. She wanted to design structures that would stand the test of time, monuments to human ingenuity, not delicate artifacts that could be brushed aside with a misplaced hand. The constraints of her gender and the whispers of disapproval that followed her didn't faze her. She was going to make her mark on the world. By her 20s, Theodate had taken on a new name, one she felt more aligned with her unique vision of herself and the world around her. Theodate, meaning gift of God, was a powerful statement. It was as if, even then, she knew her legacy would be far-reaching, both in life and in death. Under this name, she started her architectural career, teaching herself drafting and design, undeterred by the lack of formal opportunities for women in her field. By 1901, her dream became a reality when she designed and built Hillstead, her family's country estate in Farmington, Connecticut. A sprawling house set atop rolling hills was a masterpiece of American colonial revival, a style that she pioneered and perfected. Hillstead became not just a family home, but a sanctuary for art and culture, where Theodate could showcase her father's impressive art collection, including works by Degas, Monet, and Whistler. It was a place of peace, a house filled with sunlight and the soft glow of Impressionist paintings, the walls echoing with the laughter of the elite. But beneath this serene exterior, there was always a sense of foreboding, a shadow that seemed to hang over the estate. Visitors often remarked on an unsettling feeling in certain rooms, as if the house itself were alive, holding its breath, waiting. Yet, it was not just her architecture that made Theodate remarkable. She survived one of the most infamous maritime disasters in history, the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915. The German submarine attack on the passenger ship was swift and deadly, claiming over 1,000 lives. Among the chaos and the screaming, Theodate clung to life, barely surviving the icy waters of the Atlantic. She had been traveling with 2 companions, but only one survived. For hours, she lay unconscious, her body half submerged, drifting between life and death. When she was pulled from the water, she was assumed to be dead and even sent to a morgue before showing any signs of life. It was as if the universe itself had other plans for her, pulling her back from the brink of the afterlife. Though she survived, something within Theodate changed after the Lusitania disaster. She became more reclusive, even more obsessed with life beyond the veil of death. She was always a woman of conviction, but now there was an intensity to her interests, particularly in the supernatural. Whispers circulated that she had begun holding seances at Hillstead, reaching out to the dead, perhaps seeking answers about her own survival. Her close brushes with death seemed to fuel her belief in the spirit world, and she became an ardent supporter of spiritualism, the movement that claimed contact with the dead was possible. Despite her growing eccentricities, Theodate continued to work, designing several important buildings, including Avon Old Farms, a private boarding school. Her architectural legacy was solidified, but her personal life remained an enigma. She never married, and her social circle was small, consisting mostly of like-minded individuals who shared her interests in the occult and spirituality. By the time she reached her 60s, Theodate's health began to decline. Those who knew her well often remarked that she seemed increasingly preoccupied with the afterlife, as if she were preparing herself for whatever lay beyond the mortal coil. She spoke of death often, not with fear, but with an unsettling calmness, as if it were simply another architectural project to be planned and executed with precision. On August 30th, 1946, at the age of 79, Theodate Pope Riddle passed away in her beloved Hillstead. Her death, much like her life, was surrounded by mystery. Officially, she died of natural causes, but rumors swirled. Some claimed she had seen her death coming, predicting it with eerie accuracy during a seance just months earlier. Others believed that she had been haunted by spirits from the Lusitania, that they had finally come to claim her after so many years. But death did not end the story of Theodate Pope Riddle. Almost immediately after her passing, strange events began occurring at Hillstead. At first, they were small, a flickering light here, an inexplicable draft there. But soon, the incidents grew more sinister. Staff members reported hearing footsteps in the halls when no one was there, doors slamming shut on their own, and the distinct sound of a woman's voice calling out in the dead of night. Some even claimed to have seen Theodate herself, walking the grounds of her estate, her translucent figure lingering near the very windows where she once stood, gazing out over the rolling hills. The ghostly activity became so intense that many of the estate staff refused to work at night. The story spread beyond the confines of the house, and soon Hillstead became known not just for its architecture and art, but for the specter of its creator, still roaming its halls, perhaps unwilling or unable to leave the masterpiece she had crafted in life. As Hillstead's reputation as a haunted house grew, so did the sense that Theodate's ghost was not merely a passive observer. Some believed she was still protecting her legacy, keeping watch over her estate and the treasures within. Others thought she was searching for something or someone left behind. Whatever the truth, one thing became clear. Theodate Pope Riddle had not rested in peace. The eerie silence that settled over Hillstead after Theodate's passing was anything but peaceful. It wasn't long before the first strange occurrences began, subtle at first, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. The staff who stayed on after her death, those who attended to her in the house, were the first to feel it. They would whisper amongst themselves, exchanging nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. At first, it was just small things. A door left ajar when it had been closed moments before. The faint scent of Theodate's favorite lavender, perfume wafting through a room long after the bottle had been emptied and tucked away. As days passed, the unsettling feelings grew stronger. A sense of being watched pervaded the estate, especially in Theodate's private quarters. No one lingered there longer than they had to. Despite the house being filled with light during the day, the air seemed heavy, thick with a presence that wasn't quite visible but undeniably felt. It was as if the walls of Hillstead were still breathing, still alive with her spirit. One evening, Margaret, the estate's longtime housekeeper, was finishing her nightly rounds when she heard a soft rustling sound, like the swish of a long skirt against the wooden floor. She stopped, her heart racing. The hallway was empty, just as it always had been. But the sound continued, moving closer, though no footsteps accompanied it. Margaret, ever a practical woman, tried to convince herself it was just the wind, maybe a draft from one of the old windows. But deep down, she knew better. She could feel it, a coldness creeping along her spine, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Margaret wasn't the only one to experience these strange occurrences. The groundskeeper, a burly man named Thomas, had always prided himself on his no-nonsense attitude. He'd never been one to believe in ghost stories, and he'd scoffed when the staff began whispering about the strange things happening at Hillstead. But then, one night, while making his usual patrol around the estate's perimeter, he saw something, or rather someone, standing at one of the second-floor windows. The silhouette of a woman stood motionless, staring out over the grounds. The figure was unmistakably feminine, her outline visible in the moonlight. At first, Thomas assumed it was one of the maids, perhaps cleaning or closing up for the night. He squinted up at the window, but something about the stillness of the figure unnerved him. After a moment, he decided to head inside to check. But when he reached the second-floor room, the window was closed, the room dark and empty, with no sign of anyone having been there at all. The figure appeared again a few nights later, always in the same window, always standing perfectly still, watching. Thomas started avoiding that part of the estate after dark, and soon others followed suit. As the ghostly events continued to intensify, it became impossible to ignore them. One of the maids, a young woman named Alice, refused to enter Theodate's old study alone anymore. She had been dusting the shelves when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a shadow darting across the room. Startled, she turned, expecting to find another servant or even a misplaced cat. But the room was empty, and yet she swore she had seen something or someone standing there just moments before. The next morning, Alice found that every book on Theodate's shelves had been pulled out and scattered across the floor. The bookshelves, which were always meticulously organized, looked as if they'd been ransacked. Alice fled the room and refused to return, even when pressed by her supervisor. The story spread quickly among the other staff, and soon Theodate's study was avoided altogether. No one could explain how the books had been moved, but no one was brave enough to find out. With the growing number of unexplained incidents, the estate's caretakers began to fear what might happen next. Some of the younger staff left, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere and the mounting sense of dread that seemed to fill every corner of Hellstead. The ones who remained were those who had known Theodate personally, who still felt a sense of loyalty to her even in death. But even they were beginning to question whether staying was worth the escalating fear. One particular event pushed everyone's nerves to the breaking point. It happened late one stormy night, when the sky above Farmington was black with heavy clouds and lightning flickered in the distance. The thunder rumbled ominously, shaking the very foundation of the old estate. Inside, the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the old house creaked in protest, as if the storm outside was unsettling the spirit within. Margaret had just finished securing the windows when she heard a loud bang from Theodate's old bedroom. She rushed upstairs, thinking perhaps the wind had blown something over. As she neared the door, she felt a sudden drop in temperature, the air so cold it made her breath visible in the dim light of the hallway. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob, a wave of dread washing over her. Steeling herself, she pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the furniture had been thrown into disarray. The bed, once perfectly made, now had its sheets pulled back, as though someone had violently ripped them off. The paintings on the walls were crooked, as if they had been disturbed by some unseen force. And in the middle of the room, the large antique mirror that had hung on the wall for years now lay shattered on the floor. Margaret froze, her mind racing. No one else had been upstairs, and the door had been locked when she arrived. She bent down to inspect the broken glass, her fingers trembling as she reached for a shard. But before she could touch it, a gust of wind swept through the room, blowing out the candles on the nearby dresser, plunging her into darkness. She stood, paralyzed in the pitch-black room, her heart pounding in her ears. And then, in the silence, she heard it, a soft, unmistakable whisper, calling her name. Margaret. The voice was faint but clear, and it came from directly behind her. She turned slowly, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. No one. Just the cold, empty room and the faint echo of her own name lingering in the air. Margaret fled the room, locking the door behind her. She didn't sleep that night, and the next morning she tendered her resignation. The others soon followed, one by one, leaving Hillstead empty once again, save for the restless spirit of its architect, who continued to haunt the halls. The estate was soon closed to the public, rumors of its haunting spreading through the small town like wildfire. It wasn't long before thrill-seekers and ghost hunters began arriving, eager to experience the paranormal events for themselves. But what they found was far more than they had bargained for. The spirit of Theodate Pope Riddle was not to be trifled with. She had unfinished business in this world, and she was not ready to leave. The haunting of Hillstead was only beginning, and what would come next would shake those who dared to investigate to their core. As the haunting of Hillstead intensified, it became clear to those who lived and worked nearby that something far more sinister was at play. The town of Farmington had long respected Theodate Pope Riddle for her architectural brilliance and resilience. But now, her name was whispered in hushed tones, shrouded in fear. What had started as harmless stories of flickering lights and cold drafts had turned into terrifying encounters, too many to be dismissed as imagination. It wasn't long before whispers of a deeper mystery surrounding Theodate's death began to circulate. Although her passing had been officially recorded as natural causes, those who had known her well had their doubts. Theodate, after all, had been no stranger to premonitions and strange beliefs, especially after surviving the sinking of the Lusitania. Her obsession with the spirit world had only grown more intense in her final years, and some wondered if she had foreseen her own demise, or perhaps even played a part in it. These doubts found their way to the ears of local authorities, and soon, an informal investigation was quietly launched. Detective Samuel Holt, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving cold cases, was assigned to look into the rumors surrounding Theodate's death. Though skeptical of ghost stories, Holt couldn't ignore the growing list of bizarre incidents at Hillstead, nor the increasingly frantic reports from locals claiming to have encountered Theodate's spirit. His investigation began with interviews, mostly with the estate's former staff, who had been closest to Theodate in her final days. One by one, they recounted their experiences, each story more chilling than the last. Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked for Theodate for nearly 2 decades, spoke of her former employer's strange behavior in the months leading up to her death. According to Margaret, Theodate had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that something or someone was after her. She'd pace through the halls at night, muttering to herself, Margaret recalled, her voice shaky as she recounted the memories. I'd hear her whispering, like she was talking to someone, but when I'd go to check, there was never anyone there. I think she was trying to reach someone on the other side. Holt scribbled notes, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of the story. The more he dug, the more he realized how deeply Theodate had been involved in spiritualism. She had hosted numerous seances at Hillstead, each more elaborate than the last, always seeking answers from beyond the grave. Many of her guests had been prominent figures in the movement, and it seemed that Theodate had fully embraced the belief that death was not an end, but a transition. The further Holt delved into Theodate's life, the more he began to suspect that her death might not have been as straightforward as it seemed. Her obsession with the afterlife, coupled with her increasingly erratic behavior, hinted at something darker. Was it possible that Theodate had been driven to despair, her mind unraveling under the weight of her fears? Or had someone close to her taken advantage of her fragile state? The next clue in Holt's investigation came from an unlikely source. While searching through old records in the town's archive, he stumbled upon a letter written by Theodate herself, dated just weeks before her death. The letter, addressed to a close friend, was filled with cryptic references to a shadow that had been following her. She spoke of feeling watched, of being unable to sleep for fear that something was waiting for her in the darkness. They want me to join them, the letter read, but I'm not ready to go. Not yet. Holt's fingers tightened around the brittle paper as he read those words. Theodate had been terrified of something or someone in her final days, but who could have wanted her dead? And why? The detective's mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been a member of her staff, someone who had grown tired of her eccentricities? Or perhaps a relative, eager to inherit her estate? But the more Holt thought about it, the more he wondered if it wasn't something else entirely. Theodate had been a woman of great influence, not just in architecture, but in the world of spiritualism. She had made powerful friends and enemies during her lifetime, some of whom had been deeply involved in the occult. Could it be that her death had been the result of something far more sinister than simple greed? Holt's suspicions deepened when he uncovered yet another piece of evidence, a journal belonging to Theodate, hidden away in a drawer in her study. The journal, written in a hurried, almost frantic script, documented her last attempts to communicate with the dead. The final entries were disturbing, filled with references to a dark figure that had begun appearing during her seances. She wrote of voices calling to her, urging her to cross over before it was too late. "They are growing stronger," one entry read. "I can feel them pulling me, but I am not ready. There is still work to be done." Holt could feel a chill creeping down his spine as he read those words. Whatever Theodate had been involved in, it had clearly terrified her. But the question remained, had her fear been justified? Had something truly come for her in the end? Or had her fragile state of mind led her to a darker conclusion? Determined to find answers, Holt decided to bring in an expert, someone who could shed light on the strange events that had unfolded at Hillstead. He reached out to Dr. Eleanor Warren, a professor of paranormal studies who had spent years researching haunted locations across the country. Though skeptical of the supernatural, Holt knew that Dr. Warren's expertise in spiritual phenomena could provide some much-needed context for the haunting that had gripped the estate. Dr. Warren arrived at Hillstead late one afternoon, her demeanor calm and professional despite the unsettling nature of her task. As she toured the house, she made careful notes, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She examined the cold spots, the flickering lights, the areas where staff had reported seeing Theodate's ghost. All the while, Holt followed close behind, eager to hear her assessment. It's not uncommon for places like this historical homes, especially to develop a reputation for being haunted, Dr. Warren explained as they entered Theodate's study. Often, it's the result of residual energy, the leftover emotions of those who lived here. But in cases where the activity is more intelligent, where it seems to interact with the living, that's when we have to start considering other possibilities. "And what do you think is happening here?" Holt asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Dr. Warren paused, her gaze lingering on the shattered mirror that still lay in pieces on the floor. "There's something here," she said slowly. "Something powerful. It's not just residual energy. This feels more directed." Holt's heart pounded in his chest. He had come to the same conclusion, but hearing it from an expert made it all the more real. "Could it be Theodate?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Warren hesitated before answering. "It's possible. If she died with unfinished business, if she felt she had more to accomplish in life, her spirit could be tied to this place. But there's something else, too. Something darker." Holt frowned. "Darker? What do you mean?" "Doctor." Warren's eyes narrowed as she studied the broken glass. "I think whatever is haunting this house, it's not just Theodate. There's something else here, something that might have been here long before she passed. And if that's the case, it's not going to rest until it gets what it wants." Holt felt a wave of unease wash over him. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far more terrifying than he had anticipated. The haunting of Hillstead was not just the result of a restless spirit. It was something far more dangerous. And whatever had taken hold of the estate was not going to stop until it had claimed what it had been waiting for. As the sun began to set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the estate, Holt and Dr. Warren stood in the silence of Theodate's study, both of them aware that their investigation was far from over. The truth was out there, somewhere within the walls of Hillstead, but uncovering it would mean confronting the darkness that had long been buried within its foundation. The cold, creeping unease that had permeated Hillstead now morphed into something much darker, much more dangerous. What had once been whispers of a lingering presence had become undeniable manifestations of Theodate Pope Riddle's ghost, and possibly something far worse. The very air inside the house seemed to thrum with a hostile energy, as if whatever lurked within its walls had been awakened, and it would not rest until its purpose was fulfilled. Detective Holt's investigation, now bolstered by Dr. Eleanor Warren's expertise, had uncovered disturbing truths about Theodate's final days, but those revelations came with a price. The more they probed, the more aggressive the haunting became. Hillstead was no longer a place of quiet eeriness. It had become a battleground between the living and the dead. It began with small, unsettling incidents that spiraled quickly into terror. Doors that had once opened by themselves now slammed shut with such force that the frame splintered. Lights flickered, not in random patterns, but with a strange rhythmic pulsing, as if something was trying to communicate, trying to send a message no one could quite decipher. Every night, without fail, cold gusts of wind swept through the hallways, though no windows or doors had been opened. Margaret, the former housekeeper who had reluctantly returned to assist Holt and Dr. Warren, was the first to experience the full force of the escalating paranormal activity. One evening, as she prepared to close up the estate for the night, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. At first, they were faint, as though coming from a great distance. But as the moments ticked by, they grew louder, heavier, until they were right behind her, impossibly close. Margaret turned, expecting to see Holt or Dr. Warren, but she was alone. Her breath quickened and she reached for the light switch. But before she could flip it, the room plunged into darkness. The footsteps continued slow, deliberate, and then came the unmistakable feeling of cold fingers brushing against her arm. She screamed, stumbling backward, her voice echoing through the empty halls. The lights flickered back on, but no one was there. Just silence, thick and oppressive. Shaken, Margaret rushed out of the room, convinced that whatever haunted Hillstead was now targeting her directly. The following day, Holt and Dr. Warren found her packing her bags, determined to leave the estate once and for all. "I can't stay here," she told them, her voice trembling. "She know. It doesn't want us here. I felt it. I've seen it." Holt, though sympathetic, was resolute. "We're too close to the truth to stop now. If you leave, it wins. We have to see this through." Margaret hesitated, glancing at Dr. Warren, who gave a solemn nod. "There's something here, something beyond Theodate," Dr. Warren said quietly. "But I believe it's using her, feeding off her energy. If we leave now, we'll never understand what it is or how to stop it." Margaret reluctantly agreed to stay, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her growing sense of doom. She had lived in Hillstead long enough to know that whatever had taken hold of the estate was no mere ghost. It was something ancient, something malevolent. That night, Holt, Dr. Warren, and Margaret decided to conduct a séance in an attempt to communicate directly with Theodate's spirit. If they could reach her, perhaps they could uncover the true nature of what had tethered her to this world and what had twisted the energy of Hillstead into something so dangerous. The séance began in the grand parlor, where Theodate had hosted many of her own spiritual gatherings. The room was dimly lit by a circle of candles, their flickering flames casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The three of them sat around an antique table, hands lightly touching, waiting for anything to make itself known. For a long moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with anticipation, and the only sound was the crackling of the candles. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room plummeted. A sharp, biting cold filled the space, and the flames of the candles guttered, almost extinguished by the sudden draft. Margaret gasped, her breath visible in the icy air. Holt's hand twitched, but he remained still, determined to keep the séance going. Dr. Warren, her face pale but focused, spoke softly into the darkness. "Theodate, if you are here, give us a sign. We are here to help you. Show us what you need." At first, There was no response. But then, slowly, a soft creaking sound filled the room. It was the sound of wood bending, as if something heavy was pressing down on it. The table shook slightly, and the candle flames flared brighter for a brief moment. A low, almost inaudible voice echoed through the room, barely more than a whisper. "Help me." Margaret's grip tightened on Holt's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "It's her," she whispered. "It's Theodate." Dr. Warren leaned forward, her voice calm but urgent. "What do you need, Theodate? What is keeping you here?" There was another long pause, and then the voice returned, louder this time, more desperate. "I'm not alone." The table shook violently, and one of the candles was snuffed out, plunging a corner of the room into darkness. Holt's heart raced as he realized the truth. Theodate wasn't the only presence in the house. There was something else here, something far more dangerous, something that had been using her spirit as a conduit to reach the living. "What is it?" Holt demanded, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Who is with you, Theodate?" But before they could get an answer, the room was plunged into chaos. The doors to the parlor slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the windows rattled in their frames as if buffeted by a powerful wind. The remaining candles flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows across the walls. The temperature dropped even further, and the soft whisper of Theodate's voice was drowned out by a low, guttural growl. Dr. Warren's eyes widened in horror. "Something's coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Suddenly, the table was lifted off the ground by an unseen force and thrown across the room, smashing into the wall with a violent crash. The candles were extinguished, leaving them in total darkness. Margaret screamed as the growling sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be surrounding them. Holt fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. When he finally managed to turn it on, the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the destruction in the room. The furniture was overturned, paper scattered, and in the center of it all, a figure stood. It was Theodate. Her translucent form flickered like the flames of the candles, her face pale and sorrowful. But behind her, barely visible in the dim light, was something else, an amorphous shadow, twisting and writhing in the air. It seemed to cling to Theodate, feeding off her energy, distorting her presence. "Theodate," Holt whispered, stepping forward. But before he could get any closer, the shadow surged forward, enveloping Theodate's form. She let out a cry, her voice echoing with pain and fear, before disappearing entirely into the darkness. The growling ceased, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Holt, Dr. Warren, and Margaret stood frozen, staring at the spot where Theodate had been just moments before. Whatever had been controlling the haunting had shown its true face, and it wasn't done with them yet. As they stood in the wreckage of the seance, one thing became clear. They were no longer just investigating a ghost. They were facing something far more dangerous, an entity that had bound itself to Hillstead, feeding off the fear and grief of those who dared to uncover its secrets. And now that they had drawn its attention, it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The eerie silence that followed the seance lingered in the air like a weight none of them could shake. Detective Holt, Dr. Warren, and Margaret stood frozen in the parlor, the remnants of the destroyed furniture scattered around them. Theodate's cry still echoed in their ears, the anguish in her voice unmistakable. The realization that something much darker than a restless spirit had taken hold of Hillstead was now undeniable. The malevolent entity had not just trapped Theodate's soul, it had been feeding off her energy, growing stronger with every passing moment. For a while, none of them spoke. The house, which had seemed menacing before, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse with the entity's dark energy, as if it were alive, watching them, waiting for its next move. The coldness in the air seeped into their bones, chilling them beyond the physical. They knew that whatever they had unleashed wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. including them. It was Dr. Warren who finally broke the silence. "We have to put an end to this," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Theodate is still trapped, but now we know it's not just her spirit haunting this place. This thing, it's holding her here, feeding off her pain. We have to free her." Holt nodded, though his mind raced with questions. "But how?" he asked, glancing at the shadow corners of the room, half expecting the entity to reappear. "How do you stop something like this?" Dr. Warren's gaze was intense, her eyes fixed on the shattered remains of the mirror that had once adorned the parlor wall. "I've seen hauntings like this before," she said quietly, "but never anything this powerful. The entity isn't just feeding on Theodate's spirit, it's anchored to the house, tied to something here. If we can find whatever it's using to stay in this world, we can break the connection." Margaret, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Theodate's journal," she said suddenly. In her last days, she kept talking about something, an artifact she found, something from one of her seances. I didn't understand it at the time, but she seemed obsessed with it. She said it held the key to everything. Holt's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know where it is?" Margaret nodded. "She kept it in her private study. No one's been in there since she died." Without wasting another moment, the three of them made their way to Theodate's study. The door creaked as Holt pushed it open, the room beyond shrouded in shadow. Dust covered every surface, and the smell of old books and paper filled the air. The heavy oak desk sat at the center of the room, just as it had when Theodate was alive, but now it felt ominous, as if it held secrets none of them were prepared to uncover. Dr. Warren was the first to step inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She made her way to the desk, carefully pulling open the drawers. After a few moments of searching, she found it Theodate's journal. The worn leather cover was frayed, and the pages inside were yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. Dr. Warren flipped through the pages, scanning Theodate's final entries. "There," she said, pointing to a passage near the back of the journal. "She writes about an object, a small carved stone that she received from one of her seances. She believed it was a conduit, something that allowed spirits to cross over into our world. But she didn't realize how dangerous it was until it was too late." Margaret's voice wavered as she spoke. "That stone. It's still here, isn't it?" Dr. Warren nodded grimly. "It's what's anchoring the entity to Hillstead. As long as the stone remains in the house, the entity will continue to grow stronger, feeding off of Theodate and anyone else who comes too close." Holt clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. "Then we need to find it and destroy it. It's the only way to free her." The search for the stone began in earnest, the tension in the house palpable as they scoured every inch of Theodate's study. The air seemed to grow thicker, the cold more intense, as if the entity knew they were close to finding its source of power. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the floorboards sending their hearts racing. Finally, after what felt like hours, Margaret found it. Hidden inside a small, ornate box tucked away in the back of a cabinet was the stone. It was small, no bigger than a man's palm, but it was covered in intricate carvings that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The moment Margaret's fingers brushed against it, a low growl echoed through the house. Dr. Warren's eyes widened. That's it. That's what's keeping it here. But before they could act, the room plunged into darkness. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the walls, as if the house itself was alive with the entity's fury. Holt grabbed his flashlight, the beam of light flickering as he shone it across the room. The shadowy figure from the seance appeared, its form more defined now, darker and more menacing. It moved toward them with unnatural speed, its presence suffocating, as if it were pulling the very life from the air around them. "We have to destroy the stone." "Doctor," Warren shouted, her voice barely audible over the growling. It's the only way. Holt didn't hesitate. He snatched a stone from Margaret's hand and hurled it to the ground with all his strength. The stone shattered on impact, the pieces scattering across the floor. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The shadowy figure loomed over them, its darkness pressing in on all sides. But then, with a deafening roar, the figure began to dissolve. The darkness that had filled the room lifted, replaced by a strange, peaceful calm. The coldness in the air dissipated, and the oppressive energy that had suffocated the house for so long was gone. The silence that followed was almost surreal. Holt, Dr. Warren, and Margaret stood in the study, breathing heavily as they realized what had just happened. The entity was gone. Hillstead was free. But as they turned to leave the study, a soft light flickered in the corner of the room. Holt glanced over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. It was Theodate. Her ghostly form was no longer twisted with pain or fear. She stood there, watching them, her expression one of quiet gratitude. A translucent figure shimmered in the dim light, and for the first time since her death, she looked at peace. Dr. Warren smiled softly. "She's free," she whispered. "We did it." Theodate's form lingered for just a moment longer before slowly fading into the light, her presence dissolving into the air like mist. She was finally at rest, her spirit no longer bound to the house that had been her prison for so long. Holt, Dr. Warren, and Margaret left Hillstead that night. The weight of the haunting finally lifted. The house was quiet now, its dark secrets buried with the shattered stone that had once tethered the malevolent entity to this world. Theodate's legacy as a brilliant architect and pioneering woman would live on, but the story of her haunting would become just that, a story told in whispers, fading into legend. As they walked away from Hillstead, the sun rising in the distance, Holt couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The past had been put to rest, and the living could finally move on. But in the quiet stillness of the house, somewhere deep in its forgotten corners, a faint echo of Theodate's voice lingered. And perhaps, just perhaps, a part of her would always remain. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Anneliese woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Anneliese sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Anneliese began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, these hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Annelise's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Annelise, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure, no matter the cost. As Annelise entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Annelise were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishments she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Annelise's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Annelie's suffering, exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Anneliese herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Anneliese's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Anneliese's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Anneliese's suffering was spiritual, not merely medical. Anneliese, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priests advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Anneliese's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Anneliese's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Anneliese, he noted the strange shifts in her personality, moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father Alt, but these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Anneliese's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, she recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Alt urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Alt, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Anneliese's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual Romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Annalise welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Annalise began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Annelise's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Annelise's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Annelise's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room, dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the Ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Annalise sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Annelise's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Annalise, but for everyone involved. The priests and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Annelise's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Annalise refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed. Annelise's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity, when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Annelise's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Annelise's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demons seemed to resist with greater intensity. Annalise would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Annelise's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Annalise, this was no longer just about her freedom. It was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Annalise insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Annalise would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free, even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Out spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Annelise's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Annelise's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare, lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Annalise Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Annalise was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years. But they also saw the toll it had taken. Annalise could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there." The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Annelise's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Annalise was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Alt recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Annelise's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering yes and please stay with me whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Annelise's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Annelise that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Annelise's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Annelise, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Annelise Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Annelise's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Annelise's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Annelise's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Annelise's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Annelise as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Annelise herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Annelise's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Annelise, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Annelise's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Annelise's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Annelise a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Annelise's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Annelise's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice.